She had nothing. No pack, no name worth speaking aloud, no future that didn't end in a ditch somewhere between here and forgotten. For 24 years, Elara Shadowmere survived on scraps, silence, and sheer refusal to die. And the moment fate handed her the one thing that should have changed everything, the most powerful man in Arkenvale looked her in the eye and chose his pride over his soul. That rejection didn't break her. It lit a fire that would eventually burn his entire world down. Stay with me until the end of this story. Drop a like and tell me, what city are you watching from tonight? Because this one's for every person who was thrown away by someone who had no idea what they were holding. The Crystal Palace smelled like beeswax candles and expensive fur, and the particular kind of arrogance that accumulates when wealth has gone undisturbed for too long. Elara noticed these things the way she noticed everything, from the edges, from below, from the posture of someone who understood that being seen too clearly was a form of danger. She was not supposed to be here. That was the most honest sentence anyone could have spoken about Elara Shadowmere on the night of the Royal Ascension Festival. She was not supposed to be inside the Crystal Palace at all. She was not supposed to be standing in the antechamber off the East Servant corridor, clutching a basket of fresh linen against her ribs, watching lords and ladies drift past in silk and wolf fur cloaks, with the easy confidence of people who had never once worried about where their next meal was coming from. She was not supposed to exist in any room that also contained nobility. The unspoken rule of Arkenvale, older than its laws, more binding than its treaties, was that omegas without packs were beneath acknowledgement. They were furniture. They were stains. They were the accumulated inconvenience of a society that needed labor, but preferred not to think too hard about the people providing it. Elara had been living that rule her entire life. She pressed herself flat against the stone wall as a cluster of beta lords moved past, their conversation loud and careless, the kind of talk that happens when men feel completely certain no one beneath them is worth monitoring. One of them, broad-shouldered, with a silver brooch shaped like a hunting hound, stepped on the hem of her dress without looking down. She caught herself against the wall. He didn't break stride, didn't glance back. The fabric tore at the shoulder seam, a clean little rip that would take her an hour to mend by candlelight later if she could find thread. She didn't make a sound. That was the discipline of 24 years. You learn not to make sounds. You learn to absorb the collision and continue. You learned that protest, for someone in her position, was an indulgence she could not afford. The servant corridor curved left toward the main hall where the festival was already swelling to full noise, so music, crystal goblets, the thunderous underpresence of hundreds of pack wolves gathered in formal proximity. Even through the stone walls she could feel it, that low vibration that came when alphas congregated. It pressed against her skin like weather, like an oncoming storm you couldn't outrun but could at least brace against. She needed to deliver the linen to the upper prep rooms before the third bell, or the head steward would dock her wages for the week, and she'd be eating cold water soup for the next 7 days. The thought focused her. Cold water soup was an extremely reliable motivator. She turned the corner and stopped. The corridor ahead was blocked. Not by accident. 4 of them stood there, young wolves barely past their second decade, wearing the short cloaks and silver-edged collars of noble packs, alpha blood, from the way they held themselves, which meant even the youngest of them outranked her so completely that any formal complaint she might file would be laughed out of every chamber in the palace. They were talking about something that required the maximum possible amount of space and gesturing. 2 of them had goblets. One had clearly been drinking since before dinner, from the flush climbing his neck, she calculated. She could turn back, take the long way around through the coal passage, which would add 10 minutes and guarantee a docking. Or she could try to squeeze past them with a properly servile posture and hope they ignored her the way most people chose to ignore her. She went for option 2. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was practiced quiet. Not timid. She'd learned years ago that true timidity drew blood, but contained. "Pardon, milords." 3 of them didn't notice. The 4th did. He was the one with the goblet, and he turned with the particular slowness of someone who has just been handed a new entertainment. His eyes moved over her with the lazy, appraising quality of a man examining something he found mildly puzzling. Then his face shifted. Recognition crossed it, not of her specifically, but of her category. Packless. Omega. The mark on her left wrist that identified her status was visible below her sleeve, and he focused on it the way people focused on wounds. "Hold on," he said. "Look at this." The others turned. "I know what you are," the first one said. He had a jaw like a brick and the confidence of someone who had never once been told no by anyone whose opinion he respected. "Shadowmere, isn't it? The treason orphan." The air in the corridor got very still. Elara kept her face even. "I'm just delivering linen, my lord. I'll be out of your way in a moment." "The treason orphan is delivering linen to the Crystal Palace," one of the others said, slow with theatrical disbelief, and then he laughed. Not a bright laugh. A wet, thick one. "They let you in here?" "I work here," she said. Still level, still contained. There was an art to this, the exact verbal posture that was neither aggressive nor servile enough to invite escalation. She'd practiced it the way other people practiced weapons. The first one stepped forward, not threatening exactly, just occupying space, reminding her of the differential. "Your parents died for treason," he said, "against the crown, against the pact system. Do you know what that makes you in this kingdom?" She knew exactly what it made her. It made her everything he was about to say, and she'd been living inside that designation since she was 4 years old and old enough to understand why people crossed to the other side of the street when she walked past. "It makes you a mistake," he said. "It makes you a stain that should have been cleaned up when they hanged the ones that made you." Something moved in her chest. Not pain. She was past the fresh-wound phase of pain when it came to this particular category of cruelty. It was older than pain. It sat in the bone-deep place where things go after they've been absorbed so many times they become structure. She breathed through it. She counted stones in the opposite wall. "Understood, my lord," she said. "If you'll allow me to pass." "The thing about stains," he continued, and now the others were watching with the attentive interest of a crowd that expects a show, "is that they don't belong on silk. And this is a palace of silk. You understand? There is an order to things in Arkenvale, Shadowmere. Your parents couldn't accept that order, and look where they ended up." She looked at him. A full second, long enough to see him and let him feel that she was seeing him. "They ended up dead," she said. "My lord, yes, I'm aware." His jaw tightened. He hadn't expected her to finish the sentence. "Move," he said. She moved. They let her pass. One of them nudged his shoulder against hers as she squeezed by. Hard enough to jar the basket, not hard enough to make a scene. She walked the corridor and didn't look back, and the conversation behind her resumed at the same volume about something she would never be invited to care about. She delivered the linen. She stood in the prep room for 30 seconds afterward with her back against the door and her hands flat on her thighs, feeling the tremor that had been building through her palms since the corridor. She breathed, in and out. The shaking was not weakness. That was something she had decided a long time ago. The shaking was the body doing what bodies do when the threat is past, releasing what it held. She let it go, and then she was steady again. She was always steady again. That was the thing about her that most people mistook for resilience. It was not resilience, it was habit. The head steward met her at the junction between the prep corridor and the lower serving hall and told her she was 3 minutes early and would she please also assist with the crystal arrangements in the East Gallery. She said yes. She was always available to assist. Availability was the whole of her existence in this place. The East Gallery was enormous. A long room with cathedral ceilings and walls that genuinely were crystal. Great panels of it fitted into stone frames so that the candlelight diffracted into low prismatic sheets across every surface. She'd been in here before during setup, but never during the festival itself. The room was already full. The Ascension Festival drew the highest nobility of Arkenvale and a dozen allied packs from neighboring territories, and they had all gathered in this gallery ahead of the formal ceremony, drinking and consolidating alliances and performing the elaborate social calculations that constituted politics among wolves. She moved along the wall with a tray of crystal goblets, setting them on the tables that lined the outer edges, and she kept herself in the peripheral zone where servants existed, present enough to function, invisible enough not to disrupt. She almost didn't see him at first. He was in the center of the room. That should have been enough, the sheer gravitational center of him. But she'd been so focused on her task, on not spilling anything, on calculating her route around the knots of conversation, that she didn't register him until she was close enough that her body registered him before her mind did. a physical awareness that was different in quality from anything she'd ever felt before. Like her pulse had suddenly found a new rhythm and was insisting on keeping it. She stopped. King Darius Stormfang was not what the songs made him. She'd heard the songs, everyone had, the ballads about the warrior king, about the iron jaw and the golden crown, and the wolf that could bring storms with its howl. The songs made him large in the mythological sense, something built of symbol and legend rather than flesh. The actual man was different. The actual man was tall and broad and stood with a particular coiled stillness that belonged to wolves who had been in enough actual violence that they stopped needing to perform it. The crown on his head was plain. She'd expected gold and jewels and found instead hammered dark iron, simple and serious. His jaw was heavy. His eyes were gray, the particular gray of deep winter water, and they were currently fixed on whatever his general was saying to him with an expression of carefully maintained patience that suggested he'd been listening to reports for several hours and was approaching his limit. She looked at him for exactly one breath. Then she kept walking. She set the goblets. She moved to the next table. She was very focused on the goblets. The thing about mate bonds was that they weren't supposed to be subtle. The stories all agreed on this point. You felt them like a blow, like a door swinging open, like the world briefly reordering itself around a new center of gravity. The stories were absolutely clear. You knew. Elara, standing at the far edge of the east gallery with an empty tray, thought that if this was what the stories were describing, then either the stories were wrong or she was broken in a way she hadn't previously discovered. Because what she felt was not like a blow. It was quieter than that. It was the slow, creeping recognition of something she had been looking for without knowing she was looking, like turning a corner in an unfamiliar city and seeing something that feels like home. She turned and looked across the gallery. He was already looking at her. That was when she understood that the feeling was not one-sided. His general was still talking. A lord to his left had placed a hand on his arm to make some point. The room was full of everything a king was supposed to attend to. The obligations and alliances and formal requirements of power. And he was standing in the middle of all of it looking at her with an expression she didn't have the experience to fully translate. It was not desire. It was more fundamental than desire. It was the look of a man who has just received information that changes everything and is rapidly calculating what it costs. She should have looked away. She didn't. The moment held for 3 full seconds, and then his general said his name. She couldn't hear it from across the room, but she saw his lips form it, and Darius Stormfang visibly collected himself and turned back to the conversation. The spell, if that was what it had been, broke. Elara walked very quickly back to the service corridor. She spent the next half hour doing every task the head steward assigned her with the thoroughness of someone trying to stop thinking. She scrubbed tray edges. She restacked linens. She reorganized a cart of unused candles by height. These were not tasks that required mental engagement, and that was entirely the point. At some level below conscious thought, she was processing what had just happened in the gallery, and the conclusion she kept arriving at was so absurd that she kept discarding it. She was nobody. That was not self-pity. It was a material fact. She was a packless omega with a treason mark and a torn dress, and no money, and no bloodline worth claiming, and no future that any reasonable person would describe as promising. The king of Arkenvale did not have a mate bond with people like her. That was not how the world worked. It was not how anything worked. She went back to work. The formal ceremony was at the 10th bell. All servants were required to be present along the walls of the main hall, not to watch, but to manage. Flagons to be refilled, plates to be cleared, the infrastructure of celebration made invisible so that the nobility could experience wonder without confronting its logistics. Elara was given a station near the 3rd pillar from the left side, which was close enough to the center of the hall to give her a clear view of the ascension platform where the king would stand. She told herself to stop looking for him. She looked for him anyway. He arrived at the 10th bell precisely, because he was the kind of man for whom precision was not discipline but character. He walked the length of the hall with his council at a measured pace and ascended the platform and stood before his kingdom with the specific gravity of someone who has worn power long enough that it no longer felt like anything at all. The crowd hushed. Even the Crystal Palace itself seemed to get quieter, as if the building understood the weight of the moment. The Ascension ceremony was an ancient one, a ritual of sovereignty renewal conducted once each decade. The High Arbiter spoke first, a long formal passage about oaths and stewardship and the compact between king and pack. And while he spoke, Elara restocked goblets from her service position and maintained, with enormous concentration, an expression of neutral attention. Then the Arbiter's voice changed pitch. He asked the hall to observe a moment of open resonance, a traditional element of the ceremony that she had heard mentioned but had never seen. She understood it roughly. In the old tradition, great gatherings of pack wolves created a kind of collective attunement, and the Ascension Festival was specifically designed to allow the bond recognition between potential royal mates to surface publicly. A formality, mostly. The king's prospective mates had already been identified and vetted through months of court process. The three candidates stood on a lower platform to the right: a duke's daughter, a northern pack leader's eldest, and a woman from an allied territory whose name Elara hadn't caught. The resonance moment was supposed to confirm one of them. Elara was restacking goblets, then she felt it like a fist in the sternum. It was nothing like the quiet thing she'd felt in the gallery. It was enormous. It was not a recognition or a sensation or a metaphor. It was a physical impact, and it was mutual in the same instant it arrived. And she knew it was mutual because across the entire expanse of the main hall, in front of every noble and lord and representative and guard assembled, King Darius Stormfang turned away from the Ascension platform and his council and his three vetted candidates and looked directly at her. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. This is what happens in moments like these, the ones the world is not prepared for. The machine of expectation, every social architecture built over generations to ensure a certain kind of future, that machine encounters a single fact that it cannot process, and it simply stops. Every voice in the hall died. Every head turned, following the king's gaze, and found her standing at the third pillar with a tray of goblets and a torn shoulder seam and a treason mark visible on her left wrist. She couldn't move. Not because she was frozen with awe, because every animal instinct she possessed was firing simultaneously, warning and recognition, and the kind of terror that comes when you realize the thing you have lived your entire life avoiding has found you anyway. One of the lords near the platform said something to another lord. She couldn't hear the specific words, but the sound carried, the scandalized, incredulous whisper of men who have just witnessed something they find privately hilarious. Then someone laughed. A single note, high and bright, coming from somewhere to the left, and then another, and another. It spread through the hall the way fire spreads through dry grass, not instantly, but with a mounting inevitability that felt, once it began, like it had always been inevitable. The laughter of an entire court fell on Elara Shadowmere like weather. She stood in it. She had survived 24 years of cruelty. She had absorbed slights and strikes and slow systematic erasure. She had learned not to make sounds when boots caught her dress in corridors. She had mastered the discipline of invisible endurance. But she was not prepared for this, for the scale of it, for the specific quality of the sound, for standing in the center of it without anywhere to put her face or her hands. And she was not prepared for what happened next. Darius Stormfang stepped down from the Ascension platform and walked toward her. The laughter began to die as he moved, replaced by a different quality of silence, breathless, watching. He stopped at a distance of about 10 feet, close enough that she could see the exact expression on his face, and what she saw was not what she expected. It was not contempt. It was not disgust. It was something harder and more complicated. Conflict barely managed, the face of a man who has just seen what he wants and is simultaneously deciding he cannot have it. "What is your name?" he said. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "Elara Shadowmere, Your Majesty." He heard the name and something moved behind his eyes. The treason mark on her wrist, the absence of any pack sigil, the torn dress. He was reading everything there was to read about her status in the span of 4 seconds. And she could see him reading it, could see him processing what it meant, could see the political mathematics working in him like machinery. "Shadowmere," said one of his council members, stepping forward. Lord Cassian, she recognized him from state documents she'd been given to carry. He had a thin face and the kind of precise diction that indicated someone who had spent decades in rooms where words mattered more than honesty. "Your Majesty, the Shadowmere family were executed for conspiracy against the crown. The girl carries a treason designation. The bond resonance in these settings can produce false signals under It is not a false signal, Darius said. Complete silence. No one in the hall breathed. Cassian pressed his lips together. Your Majesty. I know what I feel, Darius said, and then to Elara in a voice that was controlled in the way that pressure is controlled, by effort, by constant force, by something that could fail. The bond is real. Yes, she said. She was shaking. She didn't try to hide it. There was nowhere left to hide anything. Then you understand, he said, that I'm required to address it. She waited. This was the moment. She could feel it, could feel him feeling it, the exact threshold of a decision that would determine everything that came after. She had never had power in her life, not once, not in any form. But she could feel that in this specific second she possessed something, not status, not safety, something older and stranger and far more dangerous. She watched him make the choice. His jaw set, his eyes went flat. The conflict that had been visible in him compressed into a single point and then disappeared, the way the sea levels out after a stone breaks its surface, as if the disruption never happened. I reject the bond, he said. The words were loud enough to carry. There was a beat of terrible silence. Then Lord Cassian exhaled with the controlled relief of a man who has just watched a disaster be narrowly averted. Behind him, the court began to murmur. Not laughter this time. Something more complicated. A collective processing. The sound of 1,000 people updating their understanding of what had just happened and what it meant. Elara felt the rejection the way she understood you were supposed to feel it, like something fundamental to the body had been severed. The bond snapped back on her side with a force that left her momentarily breathless, a sharp inner pain that had no external location. She kept her face absolutely still. She would not give them her reaction. She would not give this room that. Leave the palace, Darius said. Not cruel in tone, final. Tonight, do not return. She looked at him for one full second. Not with hatred. She didn't have access to hatred in that moment, only to the vast, cold, clarifying grief of a person who has just seen exactly what she is worth in the eyes of the world's most powerful man. She set the tray of goblets on the nearest table with precise care, so that nothing fell over, so that nothing broke. She turned and walked toward the service exit. The crowd parted for her, not from courtesy. From the instinctive avoidance of contagion, the collective body language of nobility who did not want even proximity to what she represented. They were already beginning to talk. She could hear the wave of it rising behind her, but she kept her pace even and her shoulders level, and she did not run. She would not give them the run. She pushed through the service door and into the cold of the outer corridor and walked until she reached the lowest servant entrance, a side door that opened onto the alley behind the Crystal Palace, where the wastewater ran in gutters between the cobblestones. She stood in the alley in the cold night air, with the noise of the festival muffled behind a foot of palace stone, and she pressed her back against the outer wall, and she allowed herself to feel it, the full weight of it, the rejection, the laughter, the way he had looked at her, not without recognition, not without the truth of what was between them, but with the deliberate decision to discard it anyway. The way his counsel had exhaled with relief, the way the room had parted, the complete and efficient machinery of a society reinforcing its own rules, using her as the demonstration. She stayed against the wall until the shaking passed. It took longer this time than the corridor had. She gave it the time it needed. Then she thought, with the specific practical clarity that had been her survival mechanism since childhood, she needed to collect her things from the servant bunkhouse, and she needed to leave the capital tonight. He had said tonight. Even if he hadn't, she knew how these things worked. By morning, the story would have propagated to every corner of the city. By the following afternoon, she would be unable to purchase bread without people recognizing what she was. No longer simply the treason orphan, but the treason orphan who had momentarily and absurdly appeared as the king's fated mate and been thrown out of the Crystal Palace by royal decree. The cruelty this city had been offering her at the normal ambient level would become targeted and acute. She was leaving. She had left places before. She had left towns, left villages, left positions she'd held for months when the situation became untenable. She was experienced at the calculation of when to go and how to carry what mattered. What mattered was very little. That was actually a form of freedom, she had decided years ago. When you had nothing to protect, you could move. She pushed off the wall and started walking. The bunkhouse was 20 minutes on foot, a converted stable at the eastern edge of the palace district. She made the walk in the dark, navigating by the gas lamps that lined the main thoroughfares, and the memory of a route she'd traveled hundreds of times. The city at night was a different animal from the city during the day, quieter, more honest in its geography, the wealth and the poverty sitting in clear adjacent relationship without the busyness of commerce to blur the line. She was perhaps 4 minutes from the bunkhouse when she heard footsteps behind her. She knew before she turned. Not by sound. The footsteps were measured, deliberately softened. She knew because of what the night had been, what the accumulated logic of her situation made inevitable. She turned anyway. 3 of them. Not the same ones from the corridor. These were older, harder, carrying themselves with the particular energy of men who had been given permission by circumstance. She recognized the sigil on their cloaks. One of the courthouses, one that had long-standing ties to the Stormfang dynasty and would have interests in ensuring that certain narratives were managed cleanly. The one in front had a broad, flat face. He stopped when she turned and met his eyes, as if her directness surprised him. "You need to understand something," he said. "What happened tonight in the hall was an anomaly. The king made his position clear. Any story you try to circulate about the bond, any claim to anyone, anywhere, will be treated as a fabrication, as a manipulation. You understand what I'm telling you?" She understood perfectly. They were not there to hurt her physically. They were there to deliver an instruction and ensure she received it. The threat was not violence. The threat was the comprehensive destruction of whatever small credibility she had left, should she choose to speak. "I understand," she said. "You'll leave the capital." "I was already leaving." He studied her for a moment. He had the eyes of a man who was accustomed to people either groveling or arguing, and her lack of either seemed to put him slightly off balance. He recovered. "The North Road," he said, "takes you away from every population center of consequence. I'd recommend it." He meant disappear. He meant become someone no one will ever find, in a place no one will ever think to look. She looked at him. Then she looked past him at the other two. Quiet, waiting, their presence its own argument. "The North Road," she said. She turned and continued walking. She did not sleep that night. She collected her bundle from the bunkhouse. Everything she owned fit in a pack smaller than a traveling merchant's bag. And she walked north out of the capital as the palace lights burned behind her in the distance, and the festival sounds carried on the wind, and somewhere inside the Crystal Palace, the celebration of King Darius Stormfang's sovereignty continued without interruption. This is the truth about rejection that no one tells you when you're inside it. It does not arrive as a single blow. It arrives as understanding. It is the slow, clarifying recognition of exactly what the world has decided you are, delivered through the specific mechanism of the person who is supposed to see you most clearly. Darius Stormfang had seen her. That was the part that made it devastating. Not that he was blind to the bond, but that he wasn't. He had seen it, acknowledged it, called it real with his own voice, and then he had made the political calculation and discarded her anyway. She walked through the night. The road north was poor, rutted, poorly maintained, the kind of road that served settlements important enough to need a route, but not important enough to warrant regular upkeep. The moon was full, which helped. She kept moving. By the time dawn began graying the eastern sky, she had put the capital far enough behind her that its lights had vanished below the horizon, and the air had changed, cleaner, colder, carrying the particular edge of elevation that meant she was already in the foothills of the northern territories. Arkenvale proper ended somewhere ahead, in a technical sense. The northern wilderness was a different designation, not a foreign territory exactly, not claimed by any neighboring kingdom, simply a region that no king had ever found worth governing because it offered nothing that conventional governance could extract. She stopped on a ridge as the dawn came. She looked back once at the south, at the pale sky over the capital, and she said nothing, because there was nothing worth saying. Then she turned north. She walked for 2 more days. She had enough coin to eat sparingly at the one small way station she passed, a rough establishment that offered dried meat and black bread and asked no questions, which meant they were accustomed to exactly the kind of traveler she appeared to be. She slept in the shelter of a fallen log the first night, wrapped in her cloak against the cold, and spent the hours before sleep taking inventory of herself. She was alive. She was intact. She had been publicly humiliated before the entire court of Arkenvale and had walked out without breaking, without weeping, without giving any of them the spectacle they'd clearly been hoping for. She had received a political warning in a dark street and had responded with the exact level of visible deference required to keep herself safe while internally filing the encounter under things that will eventually be accounted for. She was 24 years old with nothing, and she had survived every single thing this world had thrown at her. This was not nothing. She refused to allow it to be nothing. On the third day, she came to the place she hadn't known she was looking for. She'd been following a set of ruins visible from the ridge trail, stone structures that predated anything she recognized from Arkenvale's documented history, great columns half swallowed by the ancient forest that covered the northern territory's deeper interior. She'd descended toward them partly from curiosity and partly because the ground was more sheltered from wind, and she'd found that the ruins formed a rough circle around a central chamber that was still partially intact, its roof open to the sky but its walls standing, and inside it something about the quality of air was different. She walked into the chamber. The walls were covered in writing, old writing, not the common script of Arkenvale, older, the characters of a system she had never formally studied, but which she recognized from fragments she'd seen in books discarded by the scholars who'd periodically used the tavern where she'd once worked. Moonborn script. She knew the name without being entirely sure how she knew it. Moonborn, as in the dynasty, as in the original bloodline. She stood in the center of the chamber and looked at the writing on the walls. And then the writing began to glow, not gradually, not subtly. It began to glow with silver fire, each character igniting in sequence around the full circle of the chamber until she was standing in a ring of light that should have been terrifying and wasn't, that felt, instead, like the first moment of warmth after a very long cold. The light moved toward her. Not the fire itself, but the quality of it, the luminescence, traveling through the stone floor and rising into her feet and up through her bones like something that had been waiting. She put her hands out. Silver light collected in her palms. And behind her, at the entrance to the chamber, a sound. A sharp intake of breath, human and startled. She spun. A man stood in the doorway, old, white-haired, wearing the traveling clothes of someone who had been on the road a very long time. He was staring at her with an expression she had no immediate framework for. Not fear, not aggression, something more like a man who has just witnessed the fulfillment of a prediction he'd spent decades making and had never actually expected to live to see. "You lit the chamber," he said. His voice was shaking. "The last person to light this chamber," he said, stepping forward slowly with both hands raised in the universal gesture of non-threat, "was the queen who built it, 300 years ago." He stopped a careful distance away, eyes moving over her, and then settling with a weight she could feel on her face. "You have her eyes." She looked at him. The silver light in her palms had not diminished. "Who are you?" she said. "My name is Marin," he said. "I am the last keeper of the Moonborn archives. I have been walking north for 11 years looking for the heir." He swallowed. "I believe I've found her." And somewhere far to the south, in the Crystal Palace, King Darius Stormfang stood alone in his war room in the early hours of the morning and pressed both fists against the stone table, breathing against a pain that had no wound and no location and no name that a king could afford to give it. And he told himself for the fourth time in 3 hours that he had done what was necessary, and felt for the fourth time that the words meant absolutely nothing at all. The silver light did not fade when Elara lowered her hands. It retreated, that was the more accurate word, pulled back into her skin the way heat pulls back from a surface when the source is removed, leaving no mark, no residue, only the memory of warmth and the absolute certainty that it had been real. She stood in the center of the Moonborn chamber with her palms at her sides and looked at the old man in the doorway and felt, beneath every practical instinct that was telling her to be cautious, the specific exhaustion of a person who has spent too long pretending the world is simpler than it actually is. "How long have you been following me?" she said. Marin shook his head. "I wasn't following you. I've been moving toward this chamber for 11 years. You arrived here 3 days before I did." He stepped fully inside, and she saw now that he walked with a slight drag to his left leg. Old injury, badly healed, the kind of damage that accumulates when a man has been living rough for a decade. He was older than she'd first registered. Not simply white-haired old, but deep-carved old. The face of someone who had outlasted several versions of the world he'd started in. I've been tracking the lineage through bloodline documents preserved in the outer archive vaults, documents the Stormfang dynasty sealed a century ago and assumed were destroyed. They weren't destroyed. No. He moved to the wall where the script had burned, ran his fingers along it without touching the stone. They were moved, hidden, by people who understood what was at stake in sealing them. He turned to look at her. Do you know what the Moonborn dynasty was? Old bloodline, she said. Pre-Stormfang. The histories don't go into detail. The ones available to people like me anyway. The histories available to everyone have been edited. The Stormfang kings have been managing the academic record for 3 generations. He settled himself onto a fallen stone that had once been part of the chamber's inner ring, moving carefully, protecting the leg. The Moonborn weren't simply the previous dynasty. They were the founding power of this entire territory. Not through conquest, through compact. The original Moonborn queen negotiated the treaty that unified the northern wolf packs into a single sovereign entity. The power that runs in that bloodline is tied to the land itself, to the territory, to every pack that was party to that original compact. Elara was quiet for a moment, then she said, "And the Stormfangs took the throne. They took it through force, and then spent the next 80 years ensuring that the legitimate bloodline was either eliminated or lost." He paused. "Your parents were not traitors. They were Moonborn archivists who found documents proving the succession claim and attempted to bring them to the court for formal review. She had always known, in some bone-deep way she had never been able to articulate, that the treason charge was a construction. She had known it the way you know things that are never said aloud, through the quality of silence around them, through the very force with which the official version is maintained. Knowing it abstractly and hearing it stated plainly were different experiences. Her hands were very still. "They were executed," she said, "within 4 days of presenting the documents. The documents were confiscated and declared forgeries. Your mother managed to get you out before the arrest." He looked at her steadily. "You were 4 years old. You were left with a tavern family in the Eastern Quarter with enough coin to pay for 2 years of your keep. The family used the coin and then found the arrangement inconvenient." She remembered the tavern family. She remembered specifically the day they told her she would need to begin earning her space, which was the day she'd turned 6. She filed the memory back in the place she kept such things. "The documents," she said, "the ones my parents found. Where are they now?" "Stored in the Stormfang archive, the sealed level, under the Crystal Palace." He reached into his coat and withdrew something, a thin leather case, cracked with age. "But I have copies. Your mother made copies before they brought the originals forward. She sent them to me." He extended the case. "I was a junior archivist when it happened. I ran the night they arrested your parents. I've been running, in one direction or another, ever since." She took the case, held it without opening it. "Why are you bringing this to me now?" she said. "Tonight of all nights." He tilted his head. He had heard the specific weight in that phrase, "tonight of all nights," and he was reading it. He was sharp. A man who had survived 11 years of running on intelligence alone would have developed a considerable ability to read what was left unsaid. "What happened in the capital?" he said. It was not quite a question. She told him. She gave him the facts in sequence without embellishment. The festival, the gallery, the ceremony, the rejection, the men in the dark street. She kept her voice flat. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished there was a long silence in the chamber broken only by the wind moving through the open roof. "The king felt the bond," Marin said. "Yes." "And he rejected it publicly, in front of the entire court." She paused. After confirming it was real. The old man looked at the ceiling. Open sky now. The dawn fully arrived, pale gray light falling through the broken roof into the chamber's center. Something crossed his face that was complicated enough that she couldn't name it. Calculation. Something heavier than calculation. "Then we have less time than I thought," he said. She had questions about that. She filed them and returned to the immediate. "Tell me what I need to know," she said. "About the bloodline. About the power. All of it." He told her. It took the better part of the morning, and what emerged was a picture of the world she had been living in that was so fundamentally different from the official version that she had to periodically stop him and make him repeat sections simply to allow her understanding to catch up. The Moonborn Compact was not historical. It was active. The sovereignty agreement between the founding queen and the northern wolf packs was structured to persist through bloodline, not through political agreement, which meant that the Stormfang occupation of the throne was, in the most technical and fundamental sense, illegitimate. And the power that the Moonborn heirs carried, the connection to moonlight, the ability to attune to the pack bonds across the territory, was not a gift, but a function. It was the mechanism by which the founding compact was maintained, which meant that when the power had awakened in Elara, standing in this chamber with silver light in her palms, it was not simply an inheritance, it was the territory itself recognizing the heir. "How developed is it?" Marin asked. He was watching her with the focused attention of someone who has been waiting a very long time to ask this question. The power. What did it feel like? She thought about it carefully. Like stepping into water. Like pressure from every direction at once, but not painful. Like something that had been sealed was opening. She looked at her palms. I could feel the land, briefly. The whole northern territory. Not visually. More like pressure points. Pack settlements. The boundary markers. He exhaled slowly. That's further developed than I expected at first awakening. The chamber accelerated it. He leaned forward. Elara, you need to understand what this means in practical terms. The Moonborn claim doesn't simply give you a historical grievance. It gives you a legal and metaphysical basis to challenge the Stormfang throne. Not through war, though war may come, but through the ancient sovereignty mechanisms that the Stormfangs cannot simply legislate away because they are written into the fundamental compact of this territory. She sat with this. Outside the chamber, the northern forest was bright with early light, birds beginning, the ordinary business of a morning occurring as if none of the last 12 hours had happened. I'm an Omega with no pack, no allies, no resources, and I was publicly rejected by the king of Arkenvale last night, she said. Give me a realistic assessment. He didn't flinch from it. She respected that. Difficult, very difficult. The northern packs are the key. If you can reach the pack leaders and present the lineage documents with a demonstration of the power, the ancient compact requires them to recognize the heir. They cannot refuse it. It's not political allegiance. It's a bond-level obligation built into their pack structure 300 years ago. He paused. But reaching them takes time, and the Stormfang court will move quickly to manage the story from last night. If they label you as a fabricator before you can reach the packs, they already started, she said. The men in the street. He nodded slowly. Then we move faster. She opened the leather case. The documents inside were copies but clear ones, written in a careful hand on thin preserved paper. She couldn't read the Moonborn script, but she could see the Arkenvale common notation in the margins, translation fragments, reference numbers. Her parents' handwriting, she had nothing of theirs, had never had anything of theirs. But she felt a certainty looking at these careful annotations that she could not rationally account for and did not try to. I'll need to learn the language, she said. I can teach you. How long? To read it fluently? A year? Perhaps more. To read it well enough to present the documents convincingly to pack leaders? He considered. 3 months if you're quick. I'll be quick. She closed the case. Where do we start? This is the thing about people who have survived by their own resources for long enough. They develop a relationship with difficulty that is fundamentally different from those who've been protected. For Elara, the revelation of her bloodline did not arrive as a rescue. It arrived as new information, to be assessed and incorporated and built upon. The world had been arranged against her since birth. Now she had evidence that the arrangement was a construction, deliberately imposed. That changed nothing about the practical obstacles ahead. It changed everything about the interior geometry of how she held them. She was not rescued. She was activated. She would learn that distinction more fully in the months ahead. But it began here, in this broken chamber with a limping old archivist and a leather case of documents and the dawn coming through the open roof. And it felt less like fate and more like finally understanding the rules of a game that had been played against her since before she was old enough to know she was in it. 400 miles south in the Crystal Palace, the morning after the Ascension Festival arrived with the mechanical precision of a court that had been running on routine long enough that even crisis was absorbed into the schedule. The banquet tables were cleared before dawn. The musicians departed. The delegations from allied packs were seen to their accommodations or their carriages. The administrative machinery of kingship ground forward regardless of what had happened the night before, because the administrative machinery of kingship always did. Darius Stormfang had not slept. He sat in the war room, not the throne room, not his private chambers, but the room where actual decisions were made, the one with the sand table and the territory maps and the smell of tallow and strategic anxiety. And he sat there because sitting anywhere else felt intolerable, and he had not yet identified a reason compelling enough to move. 2 candles had burned to nothing on the table beside him. The sand table held the current disposition of the kingdom's military assets, little markers pushed into positions by the night strategist who worked the early shift and who had come in at the 3rd hour, seen the king sitting in the dark, and very wisely decided not to comment. Cassian arrived at the 7th bell. He always arrived at the 7th bell. Cassian was the kind of man whose value came from the reliability of his patterns, the comfort that a king could take in knowing exactly where his council members would be and when. Darius had understood this about Cassian for years and had found it useful without ever particularly liking the man. "The girl has left the capital," Cassian said, without preamble, because Darius had trained his council not to waste his time on ceremony in private settings. "Our people tracked her to the North Road. She was carrying very little. She made no stops, contacted no one." "Good," Darius said. Cassian waited a beat, evaluating, the way he always evaluated, whether a statement was actually what it appeared to be. The court narrative is cohering. The general reading is that the bond resonance was an aberration. The old ascension ceremonies occasionally produce false signals, and your rejection was appropriate management. Most of the nobility have accepted that framing. Most. There are always those who prefer to complicate. Cassian folded his hands. He had the careful posture of a man who was about to say something he had prepared. "Your Majesty, the selection process for Queen must resume promptly. The longer the vacancy remains unaddressed, the more last night's incident occupies the space that should be filled by the legitimate succession narrative." Darius looked at the sand table. "Which of the 3 candidates do you recommend? Lady Varen of the Northern Duchy, politically stable, good family, the alliance strengthens the eastern border. The Duke of Varan has been a reliable partner." Cassian paused. "She is also, frankly, everything the kingdom expects in a queen. The optics are corrective." Darius said nothing for a moment, then, "Draft the formal inquiry. I'll review it before the 5th bell tomorrow." "Of course." Cassian moved to go and then stopped, turned back. The practiced hesitation of a man who had decided to say the next thing, but wanted to appear as though he was still deciding. "Your Majesty, the bond consequences, I assume you're managing the physical effects." Darius looked at him. "The rejection of a true mate bond," Cassian continued, steady, "has documented physiological impacts on alphas. It's not a matter of weakness. It's documented. Your physician should be—" "I'm aware of the documented impacts," Darius said. Cassian met his eyes for exactly 1 second, registered what he found there, and said nothing more on the subject. He left. Darius sat with the empty room. Here is what the histories of Arkenvale and most territories governed by pack hierarchy recorded about alpha kings and the mate bond, that it was a mechanism of state to be managed and deployed in the interest of stability. Here is what the histories did not record, because it was not the kind of thing that made it into official documents, that the rejection of a true bond did not feel like a political decision after the fact. It felt like something you had amputated. He pressed both fists against the table. The bond's pull had been immediate and undeniable from the first moment he'd seen her in the gallery. He had felt it then, that recognition, that specific quality of knowing, and he had managed it, contained it, told himself it was an inconvenient sensation that responsible governance required him to set aside. And then the ceremony had forced it into the open, in front of every witness in the kingdom, and he had stood on the platform and seen her face, the torn dress, the treason mark, the stillness of a woman who was accustomed to receiving damage and had developed a posture for it. And he had made the calculation. He had made the right calculation. He kept telling himself this. The calculation went as follows. An Omega with a treason designation could not sit on the throne of Arkenvale. The kingdom's stability was maintained in part by the pack hierarchy, which was maintained in part by the social architecture of status. A king who rejected the hierarchy by legitimizing a packless outcast as queen, especially the daughter of convicted traitors, would face a crisis of legitimacy that could fracture the coalition of noble packs that held the territory together. People would die in the resulting instability. That was not a metaphor. Wars, famines, pack conflicts. These were the historical consequences of legitimacy vacuums. He was responsible for preventing them. This was the calculation. It was a correct calculation. He had run it in 3 seconds on the Ascension platform, while his kingdom watched, and he would run it again with the same result. He moved his fist and looked at the skin of his knuckles, which had split against the table. The pain was distant and unimportant. The problem with the calculation, the thing that had kept him sitting in this room for 6 hours, was that calculation operated in the realm of outcomes, and the bond operated somewhere older and more fundamental than outcomes. The rejection had severed something that his body did not regard as severable. His wolf had gone quiet in the specific terrible way that was not peace but damage. The quiet of a thing that has been forcibly stilled and does not intend to remain so. He had done the right thing. He had done the right thing. He stood finally and went to find his general because the eastern border reports required his attention, and he was a king, and he did not have the luxury of sitting in rooms feeling the cost of decisions he had already made. In the council chamber, the morning's business continued. Lord Cassian sat at the long table's head with 4 other senior council members and 3 military commanders, and they moved through the agenda with the efficiency of people whose working relationship had been refined by years of practice. Border reports, harvest projections, the treaty renewal with the Western Coastal Pacts. Then Cassian said quietly to the man on his right, while the military commanders were discussing supply lines. The bond was real. Lord Fenric, who had been with the council for 12 years and was not a man who surprised easily, looked at him sidelong. We knew that. What we don't know, Cassian said, his voice remaining in the register of a man discussing supply lines, is why it happened. A packless Omega with a treason mark, appearing in the palace during the Ascension ceremony. The probability of that combination producing an authentic bond resonance strong enough to disrupt the ceremony is not 0, but it is very small. Fenric was quiet for a moment. You're suggesting it was arranged. I'm suggesting it's worth understanding. Cassian straightened a document in front of him. The Ascension ceremony creates optimal conditions for bond resonance. If someone wanted to introduce a specific Omega into the king's proximity during peak resonance conditions, to what end? Fenric said. She was rejected. She's gone. She is, Cassian agreed. And yet the king has been sitting alone in the war room for 6 hours, and the bond rejection is causing him physical distress. And the succession question is now complicated by the narrative of the ceremony. He paused. I would like to know more about Elara Shadowmere. Her parents' case specifically. The treason file. Fenric looked at him. The treason file is sealed. Yes, Cassian said. I'd like to know who sealed it. 3 months passed. In the northern chamber, Elara learned, she learned the Moonborn script, the shapes of it first, then the phonetics, then the grammar, which operated on fundamentally different principles from the common language and required her to reorganize something basic about how she processed meaning. Marin was a demanding teacher. He had been an archivist, and archivists had a particular kind of patience that was not kindness but precision. They would wait for as long as it took for the student to arrive at accuracy, and they found imprecision genuinely uncomfortable in the way that some people found physical pain. She was a fast student. Not because she was naturally gifted, she suspected she wasn't, not in any exceptional way, but because she had been learning how to survive in hostile conditions since childhood, and learning was simply another form of that. She learned the power, too, which proved harder to systematize than language. It was not a skill exactly. It did not respond to practice the way a physical skill responded to practice. What she found instead was that it responded to truth, to the moments when she was fully present in her actual situation without the layers of management and suppression that had become her habitual mode of existence. When she let herself feel the weight of what had happened and what it meant and where she was, the silver light came naturally. When she tried to control it, to direct it deliberately, it went quiet. You've been suppressing yourself for years, Marin said one morning, watching her work. The power is underneath the suppression. You can't access it through will. You access it through release. That's not a practical training methodology, she said. No, he agreed. but it's accurate. She thought about Darius Stormfang more than she wanted to. She was honest with herself about this. She thought about him, and the honesty was the only thing that kept the thinking from becoming consuming. She thought about the way he had looked at her across the gallery, before the ceremony, before all of it. She thought about the things she had seen in his face on the platform, the conflict, the calculation, the exact moment the calculation won. She thought about the fact that he had called the bond real with his own voice and then thrown it away anyway. She was not nursing grief. She had no interest in grief as a long-term residential state. What she was doing was the colder thing. She was studying the rejection as a piece of information about Darius Stormfang, about the kind of man he was, about the architecture of his weakness and his strength. Because these things mattered. Not because she intended to seek revenge, that framing was too small, too reactive, but because the Moonborn claim and the Stormfang throne were on a collision course, and Darius Stormfang was the Stormfang throne, and you did not approach a collision without studying what you were driving toward. She also thought in her most honest hours that she had never in her life been seen, not by anyone. The moment in the gallery, that second where he had felt it, and she had felt it, and they had both known, simultaneously, that the other person knew, had been the first time in her existence that she had been witnessed in that particular and undeniable way. She would not forgive him for rejecting what came next, but she would not pretend the moment itself had meant nothing. It had meant something. That was precisely the problem. By the end of the third month, she could read the founding documents with reasonable fluency and recite the succession lineage from memory, and the power had opened enough that she could illuminate the full chamber without effort and hold it for extended periods. She had also, in the long walk she took through the northern forest when the claustrophobia of the chamber became too much, begun to feel the pack settlements in the territory, not as detailed impressions, but as presences. The way you feel heat from a fire at a distance. 7 settlements within the northern territory boundaries. Old packs, most of them, packs that had been party to the original compact. "When do we go?" she said. Marin looked up from the document he was annotating. "The Greystone Pack is the largest and the most traditionally minded. If we secure their recognition first, the others will follow faster." He paused. "But, Elara, going to the Greystone Pack means presenting yourself publicly. Once we do that, the Stormfang court will know where you are. They will know the claim is active." She met his eyes. "They sent men to a dark street to warn me to disappear. I was a rejected Omega with nothing. Imagine what they'll send when they realize what I am." "Yes," he said, "that's what concerns me." "It shouldn't," she said, "because it's already coming. The question is just whether we meet it from a position of nothing or from a position of momentum." She stood. "We leave in the morning." Marin looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Your mother," he said, "used to make decisions exactly like that. No announcement, just a direction and a willingness to hold it. She didn't know how to receive the information about her mother, so she received it the way she received most things. She put it in the place where it could be felt later, at a safer time." "Get some sleep," she said. "We have a long walk." They reached the Greystone settlement on a morning with low cloud and ice on the ground, 7 days after leaving the northern chamber. The settlement was larger than she'd expected from the outside. It occupied the interior of a natural valley, the buildings constructed from stone and timber in the old northern style, flat-roofed against the snow, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys. Old, disciplined, the kind of place that had been built to last rather than to impress. The gate guard stopped them. The guard captain was a broad woman with a scar running from her left ear to her jaw, and the no-nonsense patience of someone who had spent years managing the specific variety of stranger who believed their business was urgent. "Name and purpose," she said. Elara said, "My name is Elara Shadowmere. I am the Moonborn heir. I'm here to claim recognition under the founding compact." Dead silence. The guard captain's eyes moved from Elara to Marin and back. Her expression was not skeptical exactly. It was the particular flatness of a professional managing an unexpected situation. She had been doing this job for years, and she had a protocol for most things. She did not have a protocol for this. "Wait here," she said. She came back with the pack elder. He was not what Elara expected. She had been braced for an old man's skepticism, for formal challenge, for the elaborate defensive posturing of an institution that had maintained its independence for 300 years, partly by being suspicious of anyone who approached it with extraordinary claims. What she got instead was a man of perhaps 60, with a white beard and eyes that went straight to her left hand. Not the treason mark, she realized, but something else. A mark she hadn't consciously noticed on herself. A faint silver crescent on the inside of her wrist, just above the treason designation. He went very still. "Show me," he said. His voice had something in it she couldn't name. She opened her hands. The silver light came without effort, full, clear, flooding the courtyard with cold luminescence that turned every shadow silver and sent every bird in the nearby trees into startled flight. The elder fell to one knee. Around him, every guard in the courtyard did the same. It was the first time in her life that anyone had kneeled for her, and the sensation was not triumphant. It was something more complicated. The weight of recognition arriving after 24 years of the opposite, landing not with lightness, but with the full accumulative gravity of everything that had been withheld. "The compact holds," the elder said. His voice shook. "The heir is recognized." The silver light in her palms burned steadier, and somewhere in her chest, something that had been compressed for 24 years began, very slowly, to expand. She did not know yet what she would build with it. She did not know the cost. She did not know that 3 days from this moment, a Stormfang courier would arrive at the Greystone settlement with a royal seal and an ultimatum. Stand down, surrender the woman, or face declaration as an enemy of the crown. She did not know that the elder's answer would be to burn the seal in the courtyard fire and send the courier back with the ashes. She did not know that in the Crystal Palace, when word of the Greystone recognition reached the War Council, Darius Stormfang would stand at the head of the sand table and feel the bond pull like a blade between his ribs. Not because she had power now, but because the territory itself had begun to respond to her, and he could feel it changing under his feet. And he would understand for the first time that the woman he had rejected in 30 seconds on an ascension platform was not a problem he had solved. She was a problem he had created, and she was only just beginning. The Stormfang courier's ashes were still warm in the Greystone courtyard fire when the elder, whose name was Aldrich, sat across from Elara in the settlement's inner hall and told her what the next 3 months had to look like. He had a map, old hand-drawn on cured hide, the Northern Territory rendered in careful detail with packed settlement markers inked in a dark red that had faded over decades to the color of old blood. He spread it on the table between them and flattened it with both palms and did not look at her while he spoke, which she had already learned meant he was choosing his words with particular care. "The Greystone recognition triggers the compact chain," he said. "The other 6 settlements in the territory are bound by the same ancient agreement. When the primary pack recognizes the heir, the others have 40 days to present themselves for formal acknowledgement or be considered in breach of the founding terms." He traced a route on the map with one finger. "We have 6 settlements and 40 days. That's achievable if we move efficiently and encounter no significant resistance." "We'll encounter resistance," Elara said. "Yes." He looked up. "The question is what kind and from which direction?" He paused. "The Stormfang Court's options are limited in the north. They have no military presence above the Iron Pass, and moving troops through it takes time they may not have before the compact chain completes. Their most effective tool up here is not force. It's politics." He folded the map edge down. "They will attempt to turn the remaining settlements before you reach them. Offer inducements. Make arguments about stability and the cost of challenging the crown. Bashitski issuing bakshishi. And if they succeed? If even 2 settlements refuse recognition, the compact chain fails to complete and the claim cannot be formally activated." He said this with the flatness of a man stating a mathematical fact. "The Moonborn claim is all or nothing. That's how it was written. The founding queen wanted a mechanism that required genuine consensus. She'd seen what fragmented legitimacy produced." Elara sat with this. The firelight moved across the map's surface, and she looked at the 6 remaining markers and thought about the calculation. She thought about the man who had burned the original seal, who had made his calculation in 30 seconds on a platform while a room full of people watched. She thought about how the architecture of a decision made in haste becomes the structure everyone else has to live inside. "Tell me which settlement is most vulnerable to their arguments," she said. Aldrich looked at her steadily. "Harrowfin. Easternmost settlement, closest to the Iron Pass. Pack leader named Grest. He spent the last decade negotiating trade agreements with southern markets. He has more economic exposure to the crown than any other northern leader. He paused. He's also pragmatic to a degree that some would call principle and others would call self-interest, depending on the outcome. He's the one they'll move on first, she said. Yes. Then Harrowfin is our second stop. She left the next morning with Marin and 2 Greystone wolves Aldrich insisted on providing. Younger men, trained fighters, who said almost nothing and moved through the forest with the economical ease of people for whom terrain was a first language. She didn't protest the escort. She was learning to accept resources when they were offered, which had required a specific recalibration of the survival habits she'd built in years of operating alone. The walk to Harrowfin was 4 days through increasingly difficult terrain. The eastern ridge was rocky and steep, and the trails required concentration. She used the time to study. Marin had brought teaching materials from the chamber, and she worked the moonborn texts in the evenings by firelight until her eyes stung and the words began to dissolve into pattern rather than meaning. She was further along in the language than she'd told Marin. She'd been withholding that information not from deception, but from the old habit of not displaying her capabilities until she understood how they'd be used against her. There were things she was beginning to understand about power that she had not understood before. Power, in the version she had watched from the outside her entire life, operated through display. It needed to be seen to function. The noble wolves who had walked over her in corridors and called her a stain, their dominance was dependent on her acknowledging the hierarchy, on her performing her position in the social architecture. The moment she stopped performing it, even subtly, even just in the privacy of her own assessment of the situation, something in the dynamic shifted. The shift wasn't visible yet, but it was real. What she was building in the Northern Territory was different in kind from what Darius held in the South. His power was inherited, consolidated, maintained through institutions and force. What the Moonborn Compact offered was something older, recognition-based, consent-based in its deepest structure. The pacts didn't submit to the heir. They recognized the heir. The distinction was the difference between a door being forced and a door being unlocked from the inside. She held this thought and kept walking. They reached Harrowfin on the afternoon of the 4th day, and she knew immediately, before they reached the gate, before she saw anyone, that they were too late. It was not anything dramatic that told her. It was the small things, the way the gate guards positioned themselves, a fraction too formal, too braced, the quality of the silence in the outer yard, the fact that there were horses she didn't recognize tied at the far post, well-bred animals with southern tack. She had lived her life reading small signals in environments that could turn dangerous without warning, and every signal she was reading now said, "The ground here has already shifted." The pack leader Grest met them in the hall. He was a thick-built man in his 50s, with the kind of face that would have been frank and open in his youth and had become, over decades of negotiation, something more carefully managed. He looked at Elara with the expression of a man who has been told to expect someone and has been rehearsing his response. Beside him stood 2 men she did not recognize. Southern clothes, good quality. The smaller of the 2 had a leather satchel and the bearing of a court administrator. The larger had the build and posture of someone whose primary function was not administration. The court had beaten her here by 2 days. "Elara Shadowmere," Grest said. His voice was neutral in the careful way that neutrality is a position. "I've been expecting you." She looked at the 2 men, then back at Grest. "I can see that." A silence settled. Marin, beside her, had gone very still. She could feel it without looking at him, the specific stillness of a man who has lived 11 years on the run and knows the texture of a trap by its atmosphere. The administrator opened his satchel. He produced a document, heavy paper, Stormfang seal in dark wax. He set it on the table between them without speaking, which was a deliberate rhetorical choice, the document being made to do the talking while he maintained the plausible distance of a messenger. She looked at the document without picking it up. "Royal Declaration," she said, "designating me as what? A fabricator? An agitator?" "A traitor," Grest said. He didn't deliver it cruelly. He delivered it with the specific regret of a man who has made a decision and is now in the part of the process where he has to live with it. The document identifies you as engaged in a conspiracy to destabilize the Stormfang throne through fraudulent claims of royal succession. Anyone who provides you recognition, shelter, or material support is subject to the same designation by association. She picked up the document then. Read it in full. It was well drafted. She'd expected blunt coercion, but this was more sophisticated, layered with legal language that framed the entire Moonborn lineage as a historically disproven fabrication, citing scholars she suspected were either fictional or had been adequately incentivized. It also contained, in the section on associated culpability, language specific enough that it was clearly aimed at Northern Pack leaders who might be considering recognition. The message was not subtle. Recognize her, and the Crown declares you an enemy. She set the document back on the table. You know the compact is real, she said to Grest. She kept her voice level. You were raised in this territory. You know what the founding documents say. You know what the silver mark means. Grest's jaw tightened. What I know and what I can afford are two different things. That's honest, she said. I have 1,200 people in this settlement, he said, and now something harder came into his voice. Not defensiveness, but the real pressure behind the decision, the actual weight of it. I have trade routes that keep those people fed through the winter. I have agreements that took years to build and that can be severed with a signature from the capital. I have children in this settlement, Shadowmere. You're asking me to put all of that in front of a compact that hasn't been activated in 3 centuries, on behalf of a woman who arrived here 4 days after the Crown's declaration. She looked at him. This is the thing about power that people without it often misunderstand. The cruelty of the system rarely requires cruel individuals. It runs, instead, on the accumulated reasonable decisions of people who have something to lose. Grest was not a coward. He was not a villain. He was a man who had built a life for 1,200 people through decades of careful work, and the demand being placed on him, risk all of it on the chance that an ancient compact would hold against the full weight of a functioning monarchy, was genuinely enormous. She did not have contempt for his calculation. She understood it with a precision that was almost painful. What she did not do was accept it. You know what I am, she said. You can feel the compact responding. You felt it since I walked through your gate. Tell me you haven't. His silence was its own answer. The Crown is offering you safety in exchange for abandoning something you know is true, she said. I won't tell you that's an easy trade. I know exactly what it costs to choose the harder thing when the easier one is right there. She paused. But I will tell you this. If the compact completes, but when it completes, the territory that holds under it will be under Moonborn sovereignty, and the settlements that refused recognition will not be enemies. But they won't be inside what we're building either. The administrator started to speak. She looked at him, and he stopped. I'm not finished, she said. Then, to Grest, I'm not asking you today. I'm asking you to wait before you sign anything for the Crown. Give me the 40 days the compact allows. If I complete the chain, come to me then. If I don't, the Crown's declaration is moot anyway because the claim fails. She held his gaze. You lose nothing by waiting. Grest looked at the document on the table, at the 2 southern men, at the window where the gray northern sky was pressing down on the settlement like a hand. I can't formally hold them, he said quietly. They'll report back regardless. I know, she said. I'm not asking you to fight anyone. I'm asking you for 40 days of open doors. A long silence. The gate won't close to you, Grest said finally. That's all I can give. She took it. She left Harrowfen with 40 days and no formal recognition, and the certain knowledge that the court administrator was already dictating his report to a rider who would reach the capital in 3 days. The Stormfang Council would know her timeline. They would know she needed 6 settlements in 40 days and had completed 1. They would begin moving resources to block the remaining 5. She walked hard that evening, pushing the pace along the Western Trail until Marin said, with the careful diplomacy of a man who respected her judgment and also had a bad leg, that he needed to stop. She stopped. They made camp. The Greystone wolves set the perimeter, and she sat by the small fire and looked at the map and ran the numbers. 5 settlements, 37 days. 3 of the remaining settlements were clustered in the northwest, which meant she could potentially reach them in sequence if the terrain cooperated. The other 2 were isolated. The Deepwater settlement on the territory's northern edge was at least 6 days out in good conditions, and the last, Thornhold, was directly between the Iron Pass and the deep water, which meant it was also directly in the path of any military movement from the south. Marin sat across the fire from her. He had the map spread on his knees, and he was doing the same calculations and arriving at the same conclusions. She could see it in his face. "Thornhold," she said. "Yes," he said. "They're going to move troops through the Iron Pass. Thornhold is the staging point. They'll want it controlled before we reach it." "How long to move troops through the pass?" "In current conditions, 8 to 10 days minimum. The pass narrows and the footing is brutal." He paused. "But they don't necessarily need troops. They need one cooperative pack leader." She thought about this. "Who leads Thornhold?" He was quiet for a moment in a way that had texture to it. "A woman named Sira Voss. She's been pack leader for 6 years. Before that, she was a court advocate in the capital. She practiced in the Stormfang legal system for almost 2 decades before returning north." Another pause. "She is also, by bloodline, a distant cousin of Lord Cassian." The fire popped. Somewhere in the trees above them, something moved and went still. "You knew this," she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a data point being confirmed. "I suspected it," Marin said carefully. "I didn't know how relevant it would be until Hierophant." She looked at him across the fire. He met her eyes with the particular steadiness of a man bracing himself. "What else haven't you told me?" she said. A silence. Long enough that the fire settled and the shadows moved. "The founding documents," he said. "The ones your parents found. I told you they proved the Moonborn succession claim." He stopped, restarted. "That's accurate. But there's a second component I didn't tell you about. A condition built into the compact by the founding queen. A safeguard." She waited. "The Moonborn heir cannot claim the throne unilaterally," he said. "Even with full pack recognition, all 6 settlements, the complete compact chain, the claim requires a secondary validation, a formal challenge to the sitting monarch, conducted under the old sovereignty laws, with witnesses from both the northern packs and the sitting court." He looked at his hands. "The heir has to go to the capital, has to stand before the king, has to make the challenge directly." She absorbed this. "You're telling me," she said, "that even if I secure all 6 settlements, even if I complete the compact chain in 40 days, I still have to walk into the Crystal Palace and confront Darius Stormfang directly?" "Yes." "And you didn't tell me this before because if I'd told you in the chamber 3 months ago, when you had no power and no recognition and no understanding of what you were, you might not have started," he said. He said it plainly, without apology, which she actually respected more than she would have respected an apology. "I needed you to build the foundation before I handed you the full weight of what sits on it." She sat with this for a long time. Here's what she found when she reached the deepest floor of her reaction. Not rage. She'd expected rage. What she found instead was the cold, clarifying recognition of a pattern she had been living inside her entire life. The world managing her access to information about herself based on its assessment of what she could handle. Her parents' deaths explained as treason. Her bloodline erased. The bond rejected without her consent. And now, the final condition of the claim she'd been building toward withheld until someone decided she was ready to receive it. She had been 24 years old before anyone told her the truth about who she was. She was done being managed. "Here's what changes," she said. Her voice was quiet. It would remain quiet. She had learned that quiet was more frightening than volume when a person meant what they were saying. "You tell me everything from this point, everything in those documents, every condition, every exception, every clause the founding queen buried in the compact. You don't decide what I'm ready for. You give me the information, and you let me make the call." She held his gaze. "If you do that, I trust you completely. If I find out you've withheld something else, I continue alone." Marin looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. It was not a performative nod. It was the acknowledgement of a man who has been called to account for something real and has accepted the terms. "There's one more thing," he said. She waited. "The secondary validation. The formal challenge in the capital. The sitting monarch has the right to refuse it, to simply decline the challenge and call it illegitimate." He paused. "Under the old laws, if the monarch refuses, the heir can invoke the trial of compact, which is essentially a direct confrontation of wills, bond to territory. The compact itself adjudicates." He stopped. But the trial of compact hasn't been invoked since the dynasty before the Moonborn. There's no living memory of what it actually looks like. The records suggest it is, he searched for the word, consuming. She stared at him. Consuming, she repeated. It draws on the full power of the bloodline, he said. The founding documents describe it as the territory speaking through the air, which sounds like metaphor until you consider that the founding queen reportedly aged 2 decades in the course of the trial. He met her eyes. I don't know what it costs. I don't know if it can be survived. The fire burned low. The night pressed around the camp with its full northern weight. She had been building toward the Crystal Palace without fully knowing it, and now she knew that the road ended not at a throne, but at a confrontation with the man who had rejected her, in a room full of people who had laughed at her, where she would have to either be recognized or invoke a power that might kill her to prove she existed. This is what betrayal does, the particular kind that doesn't come from enemies. It comes from people who care about you enough to manage your path and mistrust your capacity to walk it. Marin was not malicious. He was protective in the way of old people who have watched promising things break under weight they weren't prepared for. His deception was the deception of a guardian who couldn't stop being one. It was forgivable, but it was not without cost. She felt the shape of who she was going to have to become to finish this. Not angrier, not harder, something more precise than either of those. The woman who had walked out of the Crystal Palace with her shoulders level and her face contained had been built by survival instinct, by the reflex of a person who had learned that the world required a smaller version of her in order to tolerate her presence at all. What the road ahead required was not smaller. It was the opposite. She would have to become fully what she was, not as a statement, not as revenge. Simply because nothing short of that would be sufficient for what was coming. She lay back on her bedroll and looked at the stars through the tree cover and felt the northern territory breathing under her. 7 settlements, the land itself, the old compact running through rock and root, patient as stone, waiting. Get some sleep, she said to Marin. He obeyed. Eventually, so did the Greystone wolves. She lay awake until the second watch and thought about the Crystal Palace, about a man sitting alone in a war room with split knuckles, about the precise geometry of what she was building and where it led. She thought about the fact that the path to the throne she was building ran directly through the man who had publicly discarded her. She thought about the fact that she would have to face him in a room full of witnesses and challenge everything he was. She thought about whether she could. Then she thought about the alternative. She closed her eyes. 4 days later, everything she had built came apart. It happened at the 3rd settlement, Coldwater, a mid-sized pack in the territory's western interior. They arrived to a settlement that should have been quiet and found instead that it was already in motion. Voices carrying from inside the main hall. Too many people in the yard for a normal morning. 3 horses outside the gate with Stormfang livery, but not an administrator this time. A uniform. She felt it before she saw it. A shift in the pack bond's texture that she was only beginning to be able to read, something distressed and fractured at the edges. She put her hand on Marin's arm to stop him, and they stood at the tree line and assessed. That's a royal officer, one of the Greystone wolves said, low. Rank insignia on the collar means he's authorized to make arrests. On what charge? Marin said, though his voice indicated he already suspected the answer. The officer came out of the hall while they were watching. Behind him, bound at the wrists, came Aldrich, the Greystone pack elder, the man who had burned the first seal, the man who had first knelt for her in the courtyard. He'd been 4 days' ride behind her. They had taken him from Greystone and were making an example, not of her because they couldn't reach her yet, but of the first domino in the chain. Break the origin of the recognition, publicly, demonstrably, in front of as many northern witnesses as possible. Beside her, she heard Marin exhale with the sound of a man who has been running from a system for 11 years and has just watched it execute exactly the move he always feared. The officer had a document. He was reading from it, his voice carrying enough for her to catch fragments, charges of conspiracy, of harboring a known traitor, of participating in a fraudulent succession scheme. Aldrich stood with his hands bound and his chin level and his eyes forward, and he didn't look toward the tree line, which meant he knew they were there and was making a deliberate choice not to betray their position. She stood in the trees and watched an old man pay for recognizing her. There are moments that operate as tests in the deepest sense, not tests of skill or power, but of what a person fundamentally is. What they're made of at the level below strategy and calculation. She had been building a claim. She had been accumulating recognition and legal standing and the patience of 300 years of compact law. Everything she had built depended on her not being captured, not being publicly discredited, not walking into an arrest before the chain was complete. Every practical consideration said, stay in the trees. She stepped out of the trees. Elara! Marin's voice, sharp, controlled. She kept walking. The officer saw her when she was 20 feet from the gate. He went very still in the specific way that people go still when the situation has exceeded the parameters of their briefing. He'd been sent to arrest an elder and manage a northern settlement. He had not been sent for this. My name is Elara Shadowmere, she said. She stopped at a distance that was close enough to be clearly seen and far enough to give everyone time to think. The Moonborn Heir, the person you're actually looking for. She looked at Aldrich, at the rope on his wrists, then back at the officer. Release him. Silence in the yard, complete and thorough. The officer found his footing. He was a professional and professionals recover. You are under royal declaration as a... I heard what the declaration says, she said. Release him, now. I'm authorized to detain... The silver light came. Not dramatically, not as a performance. It came the way it had been coming with increasing frequency over the past weeks, as the natural expression of a woman who had stopped managing herself down to a size the world found comfortable. It rose from her hands and spread across the ground between her and the officer, silver and cold, and every wolf in the yard felt it as a pressure in the pack bond. The compact activating, the territory speaking through the air, bold and immediate and undeniable as gravity. The officer's horse pulled at its tether. His two guards stepped back. He looked at her with the expression of a man whose understanding of reality has just been revised at a fundamental level. She walked forward. She stopped in front of Aldrich. She looked at the officer. The rope, she said. He cut it. She had done the one thing that all practical calculation had argued against. She had revealed herself, made her position known, given the Crown's forces her location and timeline, and the confirmation that the Moonborn power was real and active. She had spent her capital of invisibility in one moment for one old man, because he had burned a seal for her, and because she was done making the calculation that required her to leave people who helped her to the consequences alone. She had also, in that courtyard, done something that no document or declaration could do. She had been seen by 40 witnesses who were part of the Northern Pact network, who talked to each other, whose word traveled, whose collective account of what had happened in the Coldwater Yard would reach every remaining settlement within the week. She had given them something to recognize that was not a document or a lineage claim. She had given them an image of a woman who came out of the trees. It would cost her. She knew it would cost her. The Crown's response would be immediate and serious, and she had approximately 3 days before the force calculation in this territory changed significantly. But Aldrich stood beside her with his wrists free, and the Coldwater Pack leader had come to stand in the doorway of his hall and was watching her with an expression she was learning to read, the expression of someone whose decision has just been made for them, not by argument, but by evidence of character. The compact, she said to him quietly. You feel it. He was silent for a long moment. Yes, he said. The officer had remounted. He was leaving. He needed to report. Needed his reinforced authorization, needed everything that required distance and time and a route back through the Iron Pass. She watched him go. 3 days. 3 settlements. One old man walking beside her with red marks on his wrists, already asking her how she wanted to proceed. And somewhere on the road behind them, moving fast on the south road through the Iron Pass, the kind of answer that didn't come with documents. It came with armor. The armor came through the Iron Pass on the 2nd day, not the 3rd. She had miscalculated by 24 hours, which in military terms was the difference between a prepared position and a running one. The scouts Aldrich had sent back toward the pass returned at dawn with the news. 200 Royal Infantry, heavy cavalry on the flanks, moving at a pace that indicated they had been ordered not to stop for weather or terrain. A commander who pushed troops that hard through the Iron Pass in late season was either extraordinarily motivated or had been given a direct order from someone who didn't accept logistics as an excuse. She looked at the numbers on Marin's map. Then she looked at the remaining settlements. 3 settlements left. Deepwater, Thornhold, Asheville. Deepwater was 6 days north. Thornhold was directly in the path of the incoming force. Asheville was the smallest settlement in the territory and the most isolated, tucked against the western ridge, reachable only by a high trail that cavalry couldn't navigate. "Thornhold first," she said. Aldrich, who had been studying the same map, shook his head. "Thornhold is where they're going to establish their forward position. If we move toward it now, we walk into their arrival." "I know." "Then why?" "Because Sira Voss hasn't signed the Crown's document yet." She pressed her finger to the settlement marker. "If she had, they wouldn't need troops. They'd have sent a letter. The troops mean they're not confident she'll comply, which means she's still deciding." She looked up. "I'm not going to let them make that decision for her," Marin said, with the restraint of a man who had accepted the new terms of their working relationship and was applying them scrupulously. "The risk is significant." "Yes," she said. "Tell me something I can use." He told her. The trail approach to Thornhold had a secondary access from the northwest ridge, longer, steeper, not on any military map because it had been a pack internal route for decades, maintained by the settlement for exactly the scenario of not wanting to be approached from the south. Aldrich knew it. He could guide them. They moved within the hour. The northwest ridge approach was everything Marin had promised and worse. The trail was barely a trail, more of a collective agreement among rocks that foot traffic was acceptable here if it was careful and didn't make sudden movements. The footing was ice-glazed and the elevation gain was brutal, and the Greystone wolves moved ahead to test each section before she and Marin committed to it. Aldrich kept pace with a stubbornness that she recognized as the specific dignity of a man who would not be the reason the group slowed down, bad leg or otherwise. She watched him and said nothing and adjusted the pace slightly and pretended not to have done it. They came down into Thornhold from the northwest at mid-morning before the royal column had cleared the last section of the Iron Pass. She could see the pass from the high ridge, the dark mass of the column moving through the gap in the mountains, still an hour out at their current pace. She had at most 90 minutes. Thornhold was smaller than she'd expected. A compact settlement, stone buildings arranged in a tight cluster against the wind, walls that were more functional than impressive. The people who had built this place had been thinking about survival, not aesthetics. She approved of that. Sira Voss came out to meet her before she reached the gate. She had been watching from the wall. She was a lean woman, perhaps 50, with the upright posture of someone who had spent decades in formal legal settings and had never fully shed the bearing even after trading court chambers for a northern settlement. She wore practical clothes, heavy wool, good boots, but she moved in them like someone who remembered silk. She had Cassian's eyes. Not the color, but the specific quality of them. Assessing, rapid. The eyes of someone who processed information at a speed that most people around them didn't notice. She looked at Alaris without speaking for a long moment. "You came from the ridge," she said finally. "Yes. That trail hasn't been used in 7 years." She tilted her head slightly. "You had a guide." "I did." Another silence. Her eyes went to the northwest, where the Iron Pass was visible in the distance, and she would have seen the same column Elara had seen from the ridge. She looked at it for a long time, with the expression of someone calculating distances and arrival times, and the full matrix of what those things meant. "Come inside," she said. The hall was warm and clean and entirely without pretension. Voss sat across a plain wood table from Elara and folded her hands and said, before anything else could be established, "My cousin sent a letter." "I assumed," Elara said. He was thorough. She said it without effect. He outlined the legal exposure, the military consequences, the historical precedent for pack leaders who backed losing succession claims. He cited 4 cases. She paused. "He also told me the bond between you and the king was real, not as an argument for recognizing you, as a warning. He said your potential influence over the king made you more dangerous, not less." Elara sat with this. Cassian had been thorough indeed. He had given Voss the information most council members would have buried, and the fact that he'd exposed it meant he had calculated correctly that it would read as threat rather than sympathy. "What did you tell him?" Elara said. "I told him I'd give it appropriate consideration," Voss said, "which is legal language for I haven't decided, and I'm not going to let you pressure me into one." She unfolded her hands. "So, you have about 80 minutes before that column arrives. Say what you came to say." She said it. She had been refining this argument for weeks, in the evenings by the fire, in the hours before sleep, in the long, walking silences of the trail. Not as a speech. She didn't want a speech. She wanted the real thing, the actual substance of the claim stripped of all ceremony. She told Voss about the documents, about the founding compact's structure and its legal permanence under the old sovereignty law, about what full recognition meant for the Northern Territory, not just symbolically but practically, the specific protections of the compact's enforcement clauses that had been written to shield Pack lands from exactly the kind of crown overreach that was currently coming through the Iron Pass. Voss listened with the focused attention of a trained legal mind. She interrupted twice, both times with specific technical questions about the compact's language, and both times Elara answered in the Moonborn text directly, which produced a visible reaction. Not surprise, something more fundamental. The response of a woman who has just heard confirmation she needed and hadn't expected to receive. Then Elara stopped talking. "The column arrives in 70 minutes, she said. "I'm not going to pretend I'm giving you unlimited time." Voss looked at her for a long moment. "My cousin thinks you're dangerous." "Your cousin is right. He thinks the danger is about the bond, about what the king feels for you." She paused. "I think he's misidentifying the source." She stood, walked to the window, and looked at the distant column. "A mate bond is power over one man. What you're describing is power over a territory." She turned back. "Those are not the same thing. He should be afraid of the second one." Elara said nothing. "The compact holds," Voss said. "Thornhold recognizes the heir." 2 settlements left. 60 minutes. Voss gave her something else. A horse. A good one. Northern-bred and sure-footed, and 20 of Thornhold's wolves as escort with the specific instruction that they were to accompany the heir to Arkenvale in Deepwater and return with the recognition documentation. She gave Elara this with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had made her decision and was already in the implementation phase and did not require acknowledgement. "Go north," she said. "We'll manage what comes through the gate." She meant, "We'll absorb the collision of the royal column so you have time to reach the remaining settlements." She said it with the calm of someone who has assessed the cost and decided to pay it, and Elara felt the weight of it. The full, real weight of what it meant for people to put themselves between her and consequences she'd set in motion. She held Voss's gaze for 1 second. "I won't forget Thornhold." "No," Voss said. "I don't imagine you will." She rode north. The next 36 hours were the most punishing of the journey. Arkenvale was 6 hours at hard pace through western terrain that was brutal on horses and worse on riders. And she arrived at the settlement saddle-sore and cold to the bone and found a pack leader who had heard the story of the Coldwater Yard from 3 separate sources already. The Northern Pack network moved faster than any courier service the Crown could field in this territory. It moved at the speed of people who talked to each other, and what they were saying about the woman who had walked out of the trees had traveled ahead of her. The Arkenvale recognition took 12 minutes. The pack leader, a quiet woman named Calla, who said very little and watched everything, simply looked at Elara's hands when she arrived and said, "Show me." She showed her. The compact recognition was immediate and undeniable, a physical response in the pack bond that no political calculation could override once the power was present. "The compact holds," Calla said. "One left. Deepwater. The northernmost settlement. A day and a half out in conditions that were deteriorating. The sky was doing what northern skies did in this season, pressing down and darkening with the specific intentionality of an incoming storm that had been building long enough to mean business. She rode through the first night. She had time to think, in the long dark hours of the ride with the wind coming off the ridges and the horse finding its own footing on trails that were more feeling than sight. She thought about what completion meant. 5 settlements recognized, 1 remaining, and then the capital, the Crystal Palace. The formal challenge under the old sovereignty law, in a room full of people who had laughed at her, before a man who had thrown her away. The bond pull was not something she had allowed herself to think about directly for months. It was easier to manage at the periphery, to acknowledge its existence without examining its texture. But in the night riding, with the wind and the dark and the accumulated exhaustion lowering the barriers, she felt it with something close to clarity. It had not diminished. She had half believed that it would, that time and distance and the accumulation of purpose would erode it, would reduce it to a scar rather than an open line. It had not. It was exactly what it had been in the gallery, in that first moment before she'd known what she was feeling. Constant, specific, the precise recognition of a thing she had not known to look for until it was looking back. She was going to have to walk into a room with him and challenge his throne, and she was going to have to do it while feeling that. She rode harder. Deep water in the early morning was fog, and the sound of a lake she couldn't see. The settlement emerging from mist as she came down the northern trail. 6 days of riding and walking had brought her here. The final settlement. The old pack leader who came to the gate was nearly 70, with the careful movements of age and the absolutely unambiguous eyes of someone who had been waiting for this moment with the patience of a man who understood geological time. He looked at her. He looked at the silver mark on her wrist. The crescent, clearer now than it had been in the Heir yard, brighter at its edges. He said, "The founding queen had that mark." "I know," she said. He knelt without being asked. Behind him, every person in the Deepwater Gate knelt. "The compact holds," he said. "The chain is complete." The silver light that rose from her in that moment was different from any previous instance. Not brighter exactly, deeper, fuller. It spread from her into the ground, and she felt the territory respond in every direction simultaneously. All 6 settlements, all 6 pack bonds, the ancient compact waking along pathways that had been dormant for 300 years. She felt Greystone and Harrowfen and Coldwater and Ashvale and Thornhold and Deepwater, not as individual points, but as a network, a living thing, complex and interconnected, and now oriented toward her in the specific way that a compass orients toward north. Not because she commanded it, but because that was what the compact was built to do. She stood in it and breathed. Then she looked south, toward a city she had left on foot in the dark 3 months ago with everything she owned in a pack smaller than a merchant's bag. Marin came to stand beside her. He was gray-faced with exhaustion, and his leg was giving him more trouble than he was admitting, and he looked at her with the complicated relief of a man who has been running for 11 years and has just arrived at the destination he was running toward. "Now we go south," he said. Now we go south," she agreed. She gave herself 2 days. Not for rest exactly. She didn't have the luxury of rest, not with the Crown's military force in the Northern Territory and the clock on the formal challenge ticking. She gave herself 2 days because the people who had put themselves between her and the royal column needed to know she was coming, and because she needed to receive the intelligence that the Greystone Wolves had been gathering on the situation at the Iron Pass. What they brought her was not good. The royal column had established a forward position at Thornhold as she'd expected. Voss had managed them with the specific legal precision of a woman who had spent 20 years in court chambers and knew exactly how to be uncooperative within the technical boundaries of compliance. She had given them shelter as required under Crown law, given them supplies at the assessed rate, and answered every question they asked with responses that were accurate, complete, and entirely useless. But the column's commander had sent for reinforcement, and the second force was moving through the pass already, larger, and accompanied, according to the scouts, by someone from the capital, not military rank, court rank, Lord Cassian himself. He had come north. When she heard this, she sat with it for a long moment and understood what it meant. Cassian did not leave the capital for peripheral problems. He left the capital for things that required his direct presence because the stakes were too high to manage through intermediaries. He was here because the compact chain had completed. He was here because the situation had changed from a containment operation to something that required the most sophisticated political instrument in the Stormfang Council. And somewhere in her reading of that, she also understood something else. Cassian being here meant Darius knew the chain was complete, meant he had been briefed in full on what had happened in 6 northern settlements over the past weeks, meant he knew she had come out of a tree line to free a bound elder, meant he knew the territory was awake. She thought about what that briefing had looked like, about a man sitting at a sand table at the 5th bell with split knuckles, and that controlled, pressurized quality of someone managing a cost that has no end. She thought about what it felt like to receive information that the thing you threw away had not broken, had not scattered, had instead found its bones and built upward from them into something you could feel in the ground under your feet. She stopped thinking about it. It was not useful yet. She sent word ahead through the pack network, not to the Crown's forces, but to Voss at Thornhold. 3 sentences. The chain is complete. I'm coming south. Hold the door. Then she assembled what she had. It was not an army. She was honest about this, to herself and to the people around her. What she had was the escort that had accompanied her through the settlements, grown now to approximately 60 wolves from various northern packs who had attached themselves to the movement with the organic inevitability of people who have decided which direction history is moving and want to be on that side of it. She had Aldrich and Marin and Voss's legal knowledge and six-pack recognitions on formal documentation and the complete Moonborn compact chain activated for the first time in 3 centuries. She had the territory. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the whole argument. They moved south fast and hard, and the word moved faster than they did through the network. And by the time they reached the Iron Pass approach, the settlement wolves who had been watching the royal column's position brought her news that changed the tactical picture entirely. The Crown forces had moved, not toward her, toward the pass exit. They were blocking it. Cassian's move, clearly. If she couldn't reach the capital, she couldn't make the formal challenge. And if she couldn't make the formal challenge, the compact chain, however complete, had no sovereign mechanism to enforce it. He was using the pass as a legal as much as military barrier. She looked at the pass from the ridge approach and felt the cold settling into her hands, and thought about what walking into that was going to require. "They'll let most of us through," said one of the Greystone wolves, the quieter one, who had turned out over the journey to have an exceptionally clear tactical mind. "They want you, specifically you. The others are leverage. They want to separate me from the pack recognition," she said. Yes, she watched the position below. 200 men, established, using the natural narrowing of the pass to create a choke point that 60 poorly equipped northern wolves could not force. Not without losses that would hollow out everything she'd built by being the kind of leader who spent the people who trusted her on problems she hadn't solved yet. She would not do that. Here is the thing about power that is built on recognition rather than force. It has a different relationship with obstacles. A king with an army looks at a blocked pass and thinks about how to break through it. A leader whose authority runs through the living bond of a territory thinks about something more fundamental. Not the obstacle, but the ground beneath the obstacle. She closed her eyes. She had felt the territory from Deepwater, felt all 6 settlements, the full network of the compact. She reached for it now, not asking it for anything specific, just opening the connection fully. The silver light was immediate and strong, and she felt it spreading outward and downward, into the rock of the ridge, into the old pass below, into the ground under the boots of 200 royal soldiers who were standing on land that had been Moonborn territory for 3 centuries longer than the Stormfang dynasty had existed. Below her, she heard it before she saw it, a sound like the earth taking a breath. The soldiers felt it too. She could see the disruption in their formation, the involuntary responses of wolves who felt something in the pack bond shift beneath them, not threatening, not violent, but undeniable. The ground itself was acknowledging what it knew. Cassian, she saw, was at the center of the formation. He had felt it. He was looking upward, scanning the ridge, and when he found her, silver light visible from a quarter mile, his face went through something she could see even at this distance. Recognition, calculation, and beneath both of those, something that was harder to name. He raised his hand and the formation held. She walked down from the ridge, alone. She had told the Greystone wolves to stay at the top, which had produced significant objection that she had declined to argue with and simply overridden. She walked down toward the pass with the silver light settled around her like weather, steady and cold, and she stopped 20 feet from the forward line of the crowned soldiers. Cassian walked forward to meet her. He was exactly as she remembered, precise, contained, the court bearing that was so embedded it had become his natural posture. He looked at her with the specific intensity of a man who has been building an assessment for months from intelligence reports and is now making the final adjustment for the actual person. "The chain is complete," he said. "Yes." "You know what the formal challenge requires?" "I do." He was silent for a moment. His eyes moved over her, not dismissively, the way people had looked at her in corridors all her life, but with the careful attention of a man who is revising several significant assumptions simultaneously. "You're going to the capital." "I am. The king—" He stopped. A rare thing. She had the impression that Lord Cassian did not stop mid-sentence often. He restarted. What happened in the Coldwater yard is being discussed. The way you came out of the trees." He paused. "The king has been made aware." She waited. "He hasn't slept more than 3 hours in 4 days," Cassian said. He delivered this information with the flatness of a man who cannot decide whether he is delivering a warning or something more complicated. "I want you to know that, not as an appeal, as a fact." She looked at him for a long moment. "Stand your men down. Let us through the pass. If I do that, then you do it understanding exactly what you're choosing." She held his eyes. "I'm going to the capital either way, Cassian. The question is whether Thornhold and Greystone and the rest of them pay for the path you chose to put in front of me. That's your decision, not mine." Silence in the pass. Wind coming through from the south. The sound of 200 soldiers breathing. Cassian turned, gave an order in a clipped voice. The formation began to move, pulling back from the choke point, opening the pass. She walked through. She arrived at the Crystal Palace on a morning that smelled like the first real cold of approaching winter. That particular edge in the air that meant the season had stopped pretending. She had been riding for 3 days from the Iron Pass, and she was dust-covered and trail-worn, and she walked through the outer gate with 60 northern wolves at her back, and Aldrich and Marin beside her, and the silver light present in her hands without effort, because she was done managing herself down. The palace guard saw her. The courtyard saw her. Word moved ahead of her through the building the way sound moves through stone. Fast, unstoppable, arriving before the cause. She walked into the Crystal Palace for the second time in her life. The East Gallery. The same room where she had first felt him, where it had begun, quiet and devastating and mutual. The court had assembled. Someone had understood that this was coming and had arranged a witness gallery, lords and ladies and council members and military commanders filling the long room in the particular breathless order of people who know they are about to see something historical and have arranged their faces accordingly. She walked to the center of the room. Darius Stormfang stood at the far end, not on a platform this time. On the floor, at the same level as everyone else, which was either someone's deliberate arrangement or his own choice, and she suspected it was his. She let herself see him fully, for the first time since the Ascension platform. He looked like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had not put it down. The iron crown, the gray eyes, the jaw set in the controlled way that meant the control was costing him. He looked at her, and the bond between them detonated through the room like a pressure wave. Everyone felt it. Every wolf in the gallery, the collective intake of breath was audible. She held his gaze and did not look away. "I invoke the formal challenge," she said. Her voice was clear enough to reach every corner of the gallery. "Under the Moonborn Compact, with 6-pack recognitions completed and witnessed, I challenge the legitimacy of the Stormfang claim to Arkenvale sovereignty and present the founding documentation for formal review." The gallery was absolutely silent. Darius had not moved. His face was unreadable in the way that faces go unreadable when they are managing something too large for expression to contain. His jaw tightened once. She saw it, just that. And then he breathed. "Elara," he said. Just her name. Nothing else. In front of the entire assembled court. She heard the weight he put in it. Everything he had not said in 4 months. Everything the bond had been holding at pressure since the night on the platform. She heard it, and she acknowledged it with the private part of herself that had always been honest about this. And then she stood in her full height and waited for his answer. Because the challenge was real. The compact was real. The territory was real. And she had walked out of a stable-bed city and into the Crystal Palace carrying every bit of it, and she was not going to step back now for anything. Not for the bond, not for the gray eyes, not for the tired, specific way he said her name in a room full of witnesses, as if they were the only 2 people in it. He opened his mouth to respond, and that was when the north wall of the Crystal Palace exploded inward. The blast was enormous. Not fire, not metal, but something older and darker. A concussive force that shook the entire eastern wing and sent crystal panels shattering across the gallery in a cascade of light. Screaming. The formation of the gallery dissolved into chaos, lords and ladies diving for cover, guards rushing forward with weapons drawn toward a threat that hadn't fully materialized yet. Through the breach in the wall, through the choking dust and the cascade of broken crystal, 3 figures walked in. She had never seen them before, but she felt them, or rather, she felt what the compact felt about them. which was the specific vibration of an old territorial claim that was not Moonborn and not Stormfang. The center figure raised a hand and the dust stopped moving. "The Veyrath claim," Marin said, from somewhere behind her, his voice stripped entirely of its usual precision, replaced with something raw. "I thought they were gone. I thought the bloodline ended 2 centuries ago." The figure in the center smiled. He was young, unexpectedly, dark-haired, narrow-faced, wearing no crown, but carrying himself with the specific quality of someone who has never needed one. He looked at Elara. He looked at Darius. He looked at the formal challenge documentation still in Alara's hands. "Excellent timing," he said. "It appears Arkenvale is holding a succession debate." His eyes settled on Elara with a focus that she did not like and could not yet fully read. "I'd like to make a third case." The dust was still falling. It came down through the shattered north wall in slow curtains, catching the morning light that poured through the breach, turning the east gallery into something that looked briefly, absurdly beautiful. Crystal fragments and stone powder suspended in winter air. The wreckage of the most fortified wall in Arkenvale rendered into something that caught the light, like the inside of a geode. Elara registered this the way she registered everything under pressure. Precisely, quickly, and without sentimentality. And then she registered what was standing in the middle of it. The young man with the dark hair had not moved since he'd spoken. He stood with a particular economy of motion that she recognized as the posture of someone who had never needed to perform threat because they had never had reason to doubt their capacity for it. His 2 companions flanked him at a distance that was tactical, spread wide enough that responding to one of them meant losing sight of the others. They were trained. This entrance had been planned. The gallery was in chaos around them. Lords pressed toward the exits. Guards had weapons drawn but no order to use them. They were looking to Darius, who had not moved either, who was standing at the far end of the gallery with his jaw set and his eyes doing the rapid assessment of a man who has spent his adult life walking into situations that required immediate command decisions. He looked at Elara first, not at the intruders, at her. She held his gaze for 1 second that contained everything there was no time to say. Then she looked back at the young man. "Veyrath," she said. Marin had said the name, and she had absorbed it. "You want to explain what you just did to the north wall?" "An entrance," he said. His voice was pleasant in the specific way that pleasantness becomes unsettling, too controlled, too aware of its own effect. "I find doors introduce a kind of procedural delay I've never had much patience for." He tilted his head. His eyes were pale, and they moved between her and Darius with the interested quality of someone watching a chessboard mid-game. "My name is Kale Veyrath. I think you know something about bloodline claims, so I'll spare you the full genealogy. The short version is that the Veyrath dynasty preceded the Moonborn by approximately 4 centuries. Our territory was absorbed rather than conquered during the founding compact negotiations, and the original absorption agreement contained a dormancy clause that has been sitting in the sealed archives for 200 years waiting for someone to invoke it." "A dormancy clause," Darius said. He had moved now, forward, 2 steps, putting himself into the conversation without putting himself between anyone. The specific positioning of a man who refuses to appear to retreat, even when strategy might suggest it. That isn't a claim. That's a historical footnote. Your dynasty's legitimacy is predicated on a compact that this woman has just legally activated, Kale said, with the pleasant reasonableness of someone making a point they've rehearsed and find impeccable. The Moonborn Compact's completion destabilizes the existing sovereignty structure. It creates, technically, a moment of contested jurisdiction. And contested jurisdiction is exactly the condition under which the Veyrath Dormancy Clause becomes operative. "He smiled. "I've had lawyers working on this for 6 years. It holds." A silence in the gallery. Plaster dust settling on expensive clothes. Elara thought fast. She had 6 settlement recognitions and the compact documentation. She had the formal challenge that she had just spoken aloud in front of witnesses. She had the territory responding to her in ways she could feel through the soles of her boots. What she did not have was time for a 3-way succession crisis in the middle of a gallery full of nobles who were already in various stages of panicking. She also had something she hadn't expected to use yet. She used it now. She looked at Darius. "We need to talk." He looked at her. The bond moved between them like a current in the moment she addressed him directly, and she saw him absorb the impact of it the way he'd been absorbing it for 4 months, with the compressed, pressurized control of a man who has been fighting his own nervous system for so long, it had become a separate war from everything else he was managing. "Yes," he said. "Privately," she said. Cale spread his hands. "I'm afraid the conversation you're about to have is rather time-sensitive from my—" "Sit down," Darius said. He said it to Cale the way he said things that were not requests. Then, to the guard commander, "Secure the gallery. No one leaves, no one enters. Give the room." It was something to watch, the machinery of actual authority, the kind that had been built and maintained over decades, responding to a king's voice. The guards moved efficiently. Cale's 2 companions tensed but did not act. Cale himself put up a hand to stop them, which told her something important. He was not here for a fight. He was here for a negotiation, and he was smart enough to know that the fight or talk moment had resolved in favor of talk. The gallery emptied except for Elara, Darius, and Cale, with the gallery guards at the doors, and Marin and Aldrich holding at the perimeter, close enough to witness, far enough to allow the conversation its necessary privacy. The crystal fragments on the floor caught the light and threw it in fragments across the walls. Darius and Elara stood 12 feet apart. 12 feet. She measured it without meaning to. The specific distance between them, shorter than the width of the ascension platform, longer than it would be if either of them moved. The bond was very loud in the quiet of the cleared room. She had been managing it with the discipline of the past 4 months, keeping it in the peripheral space rather than the center. In the quiet, with him this close, managing it required active effort. He spoke first. "The compact is complete," he said. Not a question. "Yes." "All 6 settlements." "Yes." He absorbed this. His jaw moved. He looked at the floor for 1 second, the only break in the controlled outward surface, and then back at her. "I felt it. When the chain activated, I felt it. Here." He pressed one hand briefly to his sternum and then dropped it. He was not a man who made that kind of gesture easily. The fact that he made it now told her the cost of making it. "I know," she said quietly. "I had reports from the north," he said. "Coldwater, the elder." His eyes were very direct. "You came out of the trees." "Yes. You gave up your position for one man." "I gave up my concealment," she said. "Not my position. Those are different things." He was quiet for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes, complex, compressed, the working through of something he had been working through for a long time. "I've been sitting in my war room for 4 months trying to manage a situation I created in 30 seconds on a platform." He paused. "I want you to know I understand that." "Understanding it and me knowing you understand it aren't the same thing," she said. "Not yet." He looked at her with the full weight of his attention, and she understood then that whatever else Darius Stormfang was, King, Alpha, the man who had made the calculation that threw her out of the Crystal Palace, he was also someone who did not look away from difficult things when he was finally forced to face them. He had been avoiding this face-to-face confrontation for 4 months through force of will and the physical barrier of 400 miles. Now there were 12 feet between them and nowhere else to look. "You're right," he said. "Tell me what it needs to be." She told him, not gently, not with the performance of the woman who had spent 24 years managing herself small. She told him what the formal challenge required, and what the compact's second condition meant in practical terms, and what the territory was doing under their feet right now, and what the consequence of a contested succession crisis would be for the people of Arkenvale, not for the noble packs, not for the council, but for the 1,200 people in Thornhold who ate on trade agreements, for the Coldwater settlement that had watched their elder bound at the wrists, for every person in the Northern Territory who had been living under a governance structure that didn't recognize their founding rights. She told him all of it, and she watched him receive it, and she watched him do what she had not expected him capable of doing on the Ascension platform. She watched him actually listen. Not process in order to respond. Listen in order to understand. When she finished, he said, "And the Veyrath claim." She had been thinking about this while she spoke. "Cale Veyrath wants leverage," she said. "He doesn't actually want the throne. Or if he does, he wants it through deal, not through the fight he'd have to win against both of us simultaneously." The dormancy clause is real, but its activation requires the same kind of witness chain the Moonborn Compact required, and he hasn't completed that. He's ahead of his own legal position. He walked in here with a threat he can't currently back with documentation. She saw him register this. You already assessed it. I've been assessing threats since I was 6 years old, she said. I'm fast. Something crossed his face that was not the controlled king expression. It was something more unguarded than she'd seen from him in either of their encounters. A recognition of what he was looking at, arrived at too late and waited with the specific quality of regret that doesn't have anywhere useful to go. I made the wrong choice on the platform, he said. Yes. I made it for reasons I still believe were real. I know, she said. Wrong choices made for real reasons are still wrong choices. You don't get credit for the reason if the outcome is what it was. He looked at her. No, he said, you don't. This is the thing about men who have never been genuinely accountable. When they finally arrive at accountability, it goes one of two ways. It becomes performance, the elaborate theater of contrition designed to produce forgiveness quickly and move past the discomfort. Or it becomes real. The difference is visible, if you know how to read it. Darius Stormfang stood in the middle of the East Gallery he'd grown up in front of the woman he'd rejected before his entire court, and he did not perform. He stood in it. He let it be what it was without maneuvering around it. She had not expected that. She had expected several versions of him. The defensive king, the calculating alpha, the man trying to manage the bond situation into something politically workable. She had not expected the version that was simply standing in the full truth of what he'd done. She had built 4 months of armor against several versions of him. She did not take it off, but she noted that the version in front of her required a different kind of response. Here's what I'm proposing, she said. She laid it out. The formal challenge would proceed as required under the compact law, but rather than a contested succession, she was proposing a joint resolution. The Moonborn Compact would be formally activated, establishing the Northern Territory's foundational rights under the ancient sovereignty structure. The Stormfang throne would remain with Darius, but acknowledged within the compact framework rather than outside it, not as an occupation, but as a recognized governance structure in active agreement with the original territorial rights. It was not a merger, and it was not a surrender. It was the thing that should have existed 300 years ago and hadn't because the Stormfang kings had found it simpler to erase what they couldn't control. Darius was quiet for a long time. You're giving me the throne, he said. I'm proposing a structure that serves the territory, she said. The throne is one component of that structure. The council will say it's a capitulation. The council will say whatever protects their positions, she said. That's what councils do. The question is what you say. He looked at her for a moment with the gray eyes that had been looking at her since the gallery, since that first involuntary second of recognition that had started all of this. Then he looked at Kael Veyrath, who had been sitting on a stone ledge at the far side of the gallery with his arms folded and his pleasant expression carefully maintained, clearly listening to every word. The Veyrath clause, Darius said to him. What do you actually want? Kael tilted his head. Formal recognition of the original absorption terms. Territorial acknowledgement. A seat in the governance structure that reflects the historical claim. He paused. I'm not interested in war. I'm interested in existing. That's workable, Elara said. Both men looked at her. The founding compact was designed to accommodate multiple territorial claims in a unified structure, she said. That's what the Moonborn Queen built it to do. It doesn't require exclusion. It requires acknowledgement. She looked at Kael. You blow a hole in the wall instead of knocking because you were afraid of being turned away before you could be heard. A silence. Something shifted in Kael's carefully maintained expression. It was not much. A fraction of relaxation at the jaw. The specific adjustment of someone who has just been accurately read and is deciding whether to acknowledge it. The wall, he said, was also a demonstration of capacity, so you'd understand the alternative to negotiation. I understood it, she said. It's not what I want. Is it what you want? He looked at her for a long moment. No, he said. It isn't. What followed was 3 hours of the most intense negotiation she had ever participated in, conducted in the cleared East Gallery with Marin as her legal reference, and Cassian, who appeared at the second hour, assessed the situation with a precision that made her briefly and involuntarily respect him, as Darius's. Kyle had his own advocate, the administrator from the Iron Pass, who turned out to be a genuinely formidable legal mind. The Veyrath dormancy clause was real, as she'd assessed, but its activation required steps that hadn't been completed, which gave them the room to negotiate its terms rather than react to its imposition. She was better at this than anyone in the room expected. She had read the Moonborn Compact in full by now. She had spent 4 months in the northern wilderness learning the territory's legal architecture from the only surviving expert, and Marin had not withheld anything from the moment she'd asked him to stop doing so. She knew the founding documents better than Cassian knew the Stormfang archive. She could feel when an argument was using the compact's language accurately and when it was stretching, and she corrected the stretches without heat with the specific precision of someone who had earned the knowledge the hard way. Darius watched her do this and said nothing. But she felt his attention the way you feel the sun when it finds you through cloud cover. Specific, directional, warm in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. By the 5th hour, they had a framework. It was not perfect. Perfect was not available in the time frame, with the materials on hand, in the full complexity of 3 overlapping territorial claims and 400 years of historical grievance. What they had was workable, a document that acknowledged the Moonborn Compact as the foundational territorial instrument of Arkenvale, established the northern settlement's rights under its provisions, recognized the Veyrath absorption terms in amended form, and reframed the Stormfang governance as operating within rather than above the compact framework. What it required, to be formally valid, was signatures from all parties, in front of witnesses, and from Darius, something the compact law required that no document had been able to fully prepare her for. A public acknowledgement, not of the document, of her, of the bond, of the rejection and its circumstances. The compact's formal challenge resolution clause, the one that allowed a seated monarch to accept the challenge without invoking the trial, required a witness statement of the heir's standing. In plain language, Darius had to stand before the assembled court and state what he had done and what it had cost. She had known this was coming. She had read the clause. She had never allowed herself to spend too much time imagining what it would feel like to hear it. He called the court back. They reassembled with the cautious energy of people who have spent 5 hours outside a door listening to the muffled sounds of history being negotiated. The lords and ladies and council members took their positions with the slightly dazed quality of people who had started the day expecting a formal succession challenge and were ending it in something more unprecedented. Cassian stood to the side. Marin stood with Aldrich and the 60 northern wolves who had come through the Iron Pass. Kael Veyrath stood at the back of the gallery with his advocate, contained and watchful. Darius stood at the center of the room. He looked at the assembled court for a moment, a long moment, the kind that has weight. She had seen him look at rooms full of people before. She had seen him on the Ascension platform managing a kingdom's expectations with a controlled expression and a decision made in 30 seconds. This was different in quality. He was not managing anything. He was standing in front of his court and choosing, for possibly the first time in his tenure, not to manage. "I want to address what happened at the Ascension Festival," he said. His voice was the same voice, low, carrying, the voice of a man accustomed to being heard, but stripped of the particular register that had always kept a careful distance between himself and the content of what he was saying. "Before this court, before the witnesses currently present, I rejected a true bond. I did so publicly, in this room, on the basis of a political calculation that I stand behind as a calculation and condemn as a choice." Min. He paused. "Elara Shadowmere is the Moonborn heir. The bond between us was real, and I confirmed it with my own voice before I rejected it. She left this palace without allies, without resources, without protection, in a condition I created and chose not to remediate. She built what I told her, by my actions, was impossible to build. The Northern Territory, the Pax, the land, the Compact, responded to her because she is what the bloodline says she is. I did not create that. I was given the opportunity to recognize it, and I chose not to." He stopped. "That is not a failure of judgment. It is a failure of character. And I am saying it plainly because it is true, and because the people in this room deserve the truth of what their king chose and what it cost. The gallery was silent in a way that galleries very rarely achieve. Not the silence of shock, but the silence of something being received. Being actually received by a room full of people who had grown accustomed to receiving versions and framings and calculated presentations from the man standing in front of them. Elara stood very still. The bond was so present in the room at this moment that she could feel the edges of it touching the walls. She felt every person in the gallery feel it too. The pack bond resonance of a true connection acknowledged fully and openly for the first time the specific quality of a thing that had been held in compression for 4 months, releasing into the open air. She breathed. She did not forgive him in that moment. Forgiveness was not a thing that happened in moments. It was a thing that happened in the long work afterward, in the accumulated evidence of a person doing differently from how they had done before. She had been 24 years old when he made his choice, and she had walked out of this building in the dark with a torn dress and the ashes of a burned seal in the street behind her. What he had just said could not reach back through those 4 months and unmake what they had contained. Nothing could do that. But something settled in her in the gallery that had not been settled before. Not resolution, precision. The future came into focus with a clarity that surprised her, as if the acknowledgement had cleared something from the air that had been making it difficult to see. She walked forward. She stopped in front of him. The room held its breath. "I accept the acknowledgement," she said. Formal. Clear, for the witnesses. Then quieter, in the register of 2 people rather than a room. "It doesn't fix it." "No," he said. "I know." "It's a beginning," she said. "What comes after determines what it means." He looked at her. Gray eyes, 4 months of being managed pressing at the edges, the bond between them as loud as it had been in the gallery on the night everything started. "I understand that," he said. "Tell me where you want to begin." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned to face the court. "The compact document is ready for signature," she said, to the gallery, to Cassian, to Kael Veyrath at the back of the room. "Let's finish this." They signed in order. Elara first, the Moonborn heir, the formal challenge invoker, the compact activator, then Darius, then Kael, who signed with the practiced deficiency of a man who had gotten what he came for and was already thinking about implementation. Then the witness signatures, Aldrich, Marin, the Greystone Pack representatives, Cassian in his capacity as council head, 3 senior lords who had been designated to witness the document's execution. When the last signature was dry, the compact fully executed and witnessed, Elara felt it activate through the territory. Not the silver light this time, something deeper than that. The land itself, the full extent of Arkenvale, the north and south together, settling into a new agreement with itself. She felt the 6 settlements in the north. She felt the southern pack networks that she had not been close enough to feel before. She felt the boundary markers of a territory that was no longer arranged in opposition to itself. It took her breath for a moment. She stood very still and let it move through her, and then it settled, and she was standing in the east gallery of the Crystal Palace, with executed documents and 60 tired northern wolves, and the wreckage of a wall, and the winter light coming through the breach in the north facing, and it was done. What happens after the great confrontation? After the documents are signed and the acknowledgments made and the 3-way succession crisis resolved in a room that will be talked about in this territory for 100 years, is less cinematic than the confrontation itself and more true. It is the walking out of the room into the ordinary light of a winter afternoon and having to figure out what ordinary means now. It is the first meeting with Cassian 3 days later, where he is scrupulously professional, and she is scrupulously professional, and they both understand that their working relationship has been operating for 6 months in opposition and is now required to become something else. It is Marin finally admitting that his leg needs a proper physician and submitting to one with the specific reluctance of a man who has been running too long to remember how to stop. It is Aldrich going home to Greystone and burning the documents from the Crystal Palace fire in his own courtyard and starting the process of compact governance that none of them have a complete template for because it has never been done before. It is Voss writing to her cousin Cassian a letter that she shows Elara first, which is professional and precise and contains, in its final paragraph, a single sentence that reads, "I made the right call." It is Kael Veyrath departing the Crystal Palace 3 days after the signing with a formal acknowledgement and a seat reserved in the compact governance structure, and the specific air of a man who walked into a room expecting to create leverage and left with something he hadn't anticipated wanting, which was legitimacy. And it is the evening of the third day after the signing when Elara was working in the council archive, a room she had been given access to for the first time. The actual Stormfang archive, including the sealed levels, her parents' files, the original confiscated documents, all of it. And Darius came to the door. He stood in the doorway. He did not come in without asking. She noticed this. "Working late," he said. "I'm reading my parents' case file," she said. She did not soften it. She was holding a document that was 20 years old and written in the careful notation of an official proceeding, and it contained her parents' names and the charges against them and the testimony that had been used, and the testimony had been manufactured. She could see it in the inconsistencies, in the dates that didn't track, in the signatures of witnesses whose names appeared in other documents 3 weeks later, receiving significant payments from the Crown Land Office. "It's worse than I thought," she said, "and I thought it was bad." He came into the room then, uninvited but reading the invitation correctly. She had not told him to stay out. He stood beside her and looked at the document. She watched him read it, watched him arrive at the same thing she had arrived at. His jaw worked. "Cassian's predecessor," he said. "Harvin. This is his signature on the payment records." "Yes." "He died 9 years ago." "Yes." A silence. She looked at the documents and she felt the weight of what they represented. Not just the crime against her parents, but the shape of a system that had organized itself around its own preservation with such thoroughness that it had consumed 2 people who had only wanted to submit a document for formal review. A system that had produced in her the 24 years of invisible endurance and cold water soup and corridor collisions and the specific muscle memory of a person who had learned that protest was an indulgence she could not afford. "I'm going to want full access to this archive," she said. "You have it," he said. "I'm going to want the Northern settlement records for the past 50 years, the trade agreement histories, the tax records for the compact territory. Done. I'm going to find things that make the Harvin payments look minor," she said. She said it looking at the document, not at him. "I'm going to find the full shape of what was done to maintain the erasure, and I'm going to need you to stand in front of that, same as you stood in front of the gallery." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Yes." She looked at him. He was looking at the document, and his expression was the expression of a man who is genuinely reckoning with the history he inherited and stood on and benefited from, and finding it something he cannot make comfortable or digestible, and choosing not to make it comfortable or digestible. "I didn't know all of this," he said. "I know," she said. "You need to decide what that means to you, whether not knowing is the end of your responsibility or the beginning of it." He looked at her then, the gray eyes, the full weight of him, in the archive, in the quiet. "I know which one it is," he said. She nodded. She turned back to the documents. He stood beside her in the archive, and after a moment he pulled out the adjacent chair and sat down, and they worked through the rest of the file together in the lamplight, page by page. The history of what had been done laid out between them in careful official notation, both of them reading it with the understanding that reading it was not the end of anything, but the beginning of everything that had to come next. This is what the histories would record. Eventually, once the compact governance structure had enough time to produce historians who weren't subject to Stormfang editorial control, that the East Gallery confrontation lasted one morning and produced a document that changed the territorial architecture of Arkenvale permanently, that the Moonborn Compact was formally activated for the first time in 300 years, that the Veyrath claim was resolved through negotiation rather than succession crisis, that the northern settlements received the formal rights protections that the founding compact had always guaranteed them. What the histories would take longer to record, because histories are better at structures than interiors, was what it cost to get there. The 24 years of a woman absorbing the weight of erasure and becoming, through it, something the erasure had not anticipated. The 4 months of walking north through ice and uncertainty, with a limping archivist and a leather case of copied documents, and the silver light that came not when she managed herself, but when she released the management. The moment at the Coldwater Gate when she stepped out of the trees because she had decided, without fully deciding, who she was going to be. True strength is not the absence of cost. It is the willingness to pay what the situation requires and continue standing. Elara Shadowmere had paid in the currency available to her: time, endurance, the accumulated discipline of someone who had never been given the luxury of falling apart in view of anyone who might use it against her. She had converted that payment into something the territory could recognize, and the territory had. That was not a metaphor. It was the literal mechanism of the compact. The land itself, the pact bonds, the 300-year agreement between a founding queen and the wolves of the Northern Territory, all of it responding to the presence of someone who had earned recognition by proving she could hold what recognition required. A queen was not made by a throne. Elara had understood this intellectually for months. She understood it in her body now, in the archive room on the third day after the signing, reading her parents' names and documents that had been sealed to keep their truth from reaching her. The throne was one component. The archive was another. The 60 wolves who had walked through the Iron Pass with her were another. The elder who had burned the first seal and stood with his wrists bound rather than betray her position in the tree line, that was another. It was built from people and choices and the specific quality of a leader who was willing to come out of the trees when it mattered. 3 months later, on a morning in early spring when the Northern Territory was doing what it did in spring, revealing itself from under the winter, quietly astonishing, the kind of beauty that is more affecting for having been hidden so long. Elara stood on the northern wall of the Crystal Palace and looked at the territory that stretched in every direction and felt the compact network in the ground below her. All 6 settlements. The southern pacts, newly in communication with the northern governance structure. The Veyrath territory to the west, cautious and watchful, and beginning, very slowly, to engage. Darius came to stand beside her. He had been doing this, appearing, not demanding, occupying the adjacent space and letting her determine what she did with it. It was the behavior of a man who understood, finally, that presence was something offered and not assumed. She had noted it over the 3 months and had said nothing about it because the saying would have changed it, and she wanted it to continue. Greystone sent a harvest projection, he said. Better than last year. The compact governance restored 3 trade routes they'd lost, she said. It'll improve further. They stood together in the spring morning. Below the wall, the capital was waking up. The ordinary sounds of a city going about its life. The sounds that continued regardless of what happened in crystal galleries or council chambers or sealed archives. The sounds that were the whole point of everything. You should know, he said, that I'm not going to stop. She looked at him. Whatever this is, he said. Whatever the right pace is, whatever you need it to look like. I'm not going to stop. He said it with the specific steadiness of a man who has examined what he is committing to and found that he means it in the full, uncaveated sense. I know that doesn't fix what I did. I'm not offering it as a fix. I'm offering it as a fact. She looked at him for a long moment. She had spent 4 months building an architecture of self-sufficiency that was genuine and permanent and not going anywhere. She was not a woman who had arrived here needing to be completed. She had arrived here complete, forged complete by the specific conditions of her history. And what she was standing next to was not a missing piece, but something different. A person who had also paid a cost and arrived somewhere new and was standing in his northern wall's morning light trying to navigate an honesty he hadn't been capable of on an ascension platform 9 months ago. I know, she said. She looked back at the territory. The spring light on the northern hills. The compact humming under her feet with the steady frequency of something that had been waiting 3 centuries and was now, finally, awake. She was 25 years old. She had come from stables and cold corridors and the specific silence of a person who had spent her life not making sounds. She had walked into the north in the dark with nothing, and she had walked back through the Iron Pass with 60 wolves and 6 recognitions, and the full weight of a founding compact activated in her hands. She had stood in a gallery before the man who rejected her and challenged his throne, and negotiated his counsel, and read his secrets in his own archive, and come out the other side not softened by the process, but refined. The difference was important. The greatest version of a person is not the one who was never damaged. It is the one who was damaged and understood what the damage was trying to teach. Not the lesson that the people who caused the damage intended. That lesson was wrong, built from their own fear, their own limitation, their own investment in a world that needed her to be nothing. The real lesson was older and simpler, and it went like this. The world telling you that you are nothing is information about the world. It is not information about you. She had always known, somewhere below the management and the discipline and the cold water soup survival, that she was not nothing. She had known it the way you know things that you cannot yet prove. The compact had given her the proof. The territory had given her the proof. The 60 wolves through the Iron Pass had given her the proof. And Darius Stormfang, standing on the northern wall in the spring light of his own palace, was giving her a different kind of proof. The proof that even the person who had tried hardest to make her nothing had arrived. Finally, at the same understanding she had always carried. She was not nothing. She had never been nothing. She was the moonborn heir. She was the woman who had come out of the trees. She was the leader who had read the law better than the lawyers, who had felt the territory breathing under stone and acted on what she felt, who had signed a document that changed the architecture of a kingdom in a room where 9 months ago people had laughed at her shoes. She was beginning now the Queen of Arkenvale, not because of the man beside her, not because of the bond or the bloodline or the compact or the battle, because she had earned it. In the oldest and most thorough sense of that word, she had paid for it with 24 years of invisible survival and 4 months of visible becoming, and it was hers in the way that things are yours when you have built them from nothing, in the cold, in the dark, with your own hands. She stood in the spring morning. She let herself feel it. The territory breathed. The compact hummed. The silver light settled warm in her palms. She was home.